You good? Okay. Okay, if you could grab a seat, we're going to get started. Okay, here we go.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Michael Geist. I'm a law professor at the University of Ottawa, and I'm also the chair of the Digital Strategy Advisory Panel for Waterfront Toronto. And it is a pleasure to welcome everyone here today. Thank you for sticking with us. We were just reflecting that had we tried to hold this when it was initially scheduled, I know I wouldn't have been here. And I think a lot of other people were facing the same challenges given the weather. So thanks to many of you for being able to alter your schedule and come out, and thanks to Mars for also accommodating the shift. For those that don't know, the Digital Strategy Advisory Panel is obviously an advisory panel to Waterfront Toronto that was established soon it will be a year ago, and we have up until recently been meeting on a monthly basis to examine many of the digital issues that arise particularly out of the Quayside project, and there are a number of members of that panel here in the room today. Perhaps you have a chance to meet some of them, and I know we've even got at least one who's going to be who's part of the agenda to present. I should note that all of our meetings are held openly. The documents themselves are available. There are videos, YouTube videos of the meetings themselves, and so you're certainly welcome to attend. I have to say, speaking for myself, if I think back to the myriad of issues that we've engaged and talked about over the last number of months, I'd say that it is this issue, the digital stewardship issue, that has really been, I think, one of the most interesting and challenging issues that has come up. In a project and an issue that raises all sorts of potential for new kinds of innovation, the prospect of policy innovation in the use of things like potentially a civic data trust really provides, I think, some really interesting opportunities. And for those that had a chance to take a look at some of the background information, no shortages of questions and challenges. And so I'm grateful that you're all here today. This is an opportunity to really engage with some of these kinds of things. There's I think, a lot to be excited about, but at the same time, a lot to be realistic about. And I'm hopeful that over the next few hours, we can all engage in a really valuable and fruitful conversation on some of these issues. So thanks again for coming out. And with that, I will turn it over to Nicole.
Hi, everybody. My name is Nicole Sullivan. I'm here as your facilitator today, along with a number of members of the Sullivan team. We're seated at tables to capture your discussions. We're a third-party process stewards. Our firm works exclusively for governments, public agencies, occasionally nonprofits. And in that role, we never advocate for a particular outcome of the processes that we help facilitate. Really, we focus on facilitating constructive discussions, making sure people have the information they need to understand the consequences of different courses of action and to weigh in intelligently on it. This is, by the way, totally consistent with Waterfront Toronto's public consultation strategy you can find online. It's dedicated to a number of things, but facilitating input of creative ideas is a nice one to flag for today. Strengthen the information on which waterfront revitalization decisions are based. Build bridges between individuals and groups with different opinions, and providing opportunities to learn and resolve conflicts. And for those of you who were at the first Civic Lab, there was no shortage of a range of opinions emerging. So on that, give me a sense, were you here for the first Civic Lab? Stick your hands straight up. About maybe a quarter of the room. Okay, great. Welcome back, everybody who's new. Welcome. And we will have a series of presentations that Waterfront Toronto will be leading to sort of set the context for the discussion today. Another job of our firm is to do a summary of what we hear here. If you were at the first Civic Lab, you would have received a draft of sort of the high-level key messages that emerged. Take a look at it. If that draft doesn't jive with what you think's happened in the room, let us know and we'll tweak it. But we really reinforce some of those very important process tools to demonstrate the connection between the discussions you're having and the ultimate input that's provided to the decision-making process. So I'm going to quickly review the agenda, and then I'm going to get you all to introduce yourselves very quickly. Given the diversity of people in the room, we think it's very important to get a flavor for who you are, what organization you're with. And we'll do it very rapid fire. But first, when you came in, you would have been handed an agenda that looks like this. Maybe grab it, and I'll walk you through it. It's the same as the one you received in advance. For some of you, it'll just be a refresher. Christina Werner is the Vice President, Innovation, Sustainability, and Prosperity at Waterfront Toronto. She's going to lead off with 20 minutes to really set the stage for the discussion today. Michael Noble from the City of Toronto is going to provide an update from their perspective, short and sweet, but it's very important to demonstrate the connection between the work that Waterfront Toronto is doing and the role that the other three levels of government are playing in this process. Then we'll have a bit of an overview briefing from both Lisa Austin from U of T and Kevin Tour from Communitech. They're going to really set the stage for the international context in which this conversation is being held, and then about the open data process and landscape. We'll have a chance to have some discussion. We'll take a bit of a break at 3, in and around there. And then we'll focus more specifically on a subset of that broader context on models of digital trusts, and then the work that Mars had done on behalf of Waterfront Toronto or for Waterfront Toronto with their report on the Civic Digital Trust, which the link was distributed prior to the meeting. We'll have a good hour after that again for more discussion, and then wrap up by 5 o'clock. Waterfront Toronto has given some thought to the question that would be most useful to pose to you as a group, and it's just on the bottom of your agenda there, which is really based on the information discussed here, as well as your own insights and expertise. What ideas or advice would you like to see Waterfront Toronto consider related to data stewardship at Quayside? And it's in that context you've been invited here today. If you've got other stuff to say, no problem. Don't worry about the question. But at least it gives you a sense of how open that is, but also the focus really on a data stewardship at Quayside. And on your tables, you'll see that Waterfront Toronto has given some thought to the digital ecosystem writ large, the different actors within it, and that'll be part of Christina's overview remarks today. So very quickly, starting closest to the front, tell us who you are and what organization you're with, and we'll just move it around the table.
Okay, thanks. I'm Tim Banks. I'm with a law firm, Innovation LLP, and I'm an advisor to Waterfront Toronto.
Lovely. John.
My name is John Willis. I'm a designer, and I'm currently working with the International Standards Organization to develop standards in this area. I also have a full-time job at the Ministry of Children and Community Social Services, but I don't represent the ministry in any way today.
I'm Cal Delamam. I'm the CEO of Privacy Analytics and also professor and faculty of medicine at the University of Ottawa.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sorana Ionescu, Director of Smart Metering Entity with the ISO.
Jeff Evanson, part of the facilitation team.
Peter McFadgen, Ontario Centres of Excellence.
Suzanne Kavanagh, I'm on the board for Waterfront for All, which has been part of many of the stakeholder advisory committees with Waterfront Toronto.
Sean Tippins, I'm with Infrastructure Canada's Investment Partnerships and Innovation Branch.
Ian Malcheski, I'm part of Nicole Sullivan's team.
I'm Chelsea Colbert. I'm with Fasken and on Sidewalk Lab's Privacy and Data Governance team.
Hi, I'm David Fuhr. I'm the director of Civic, the technology law clinic at the University of Ottawa.
Mark Wilson. I'm a member of the Waterfront Digital Strategy Advisory Panel and formerly the chair of Waterfront Toronto.
Alex Ryan, VP Solutions Lab at Mars.
Brenda McPhail at the Canadian Civil Liberties Association.
Letitia Biaggi, Ministry of Energy.
I'm Brian G. Smith. I'm with the facilitation team.
Sharon Nakwi, also with the Ministry of Energy.
Carmen De Rosa with Statistics Canada.
Sylvie Michaud, Statistics Canada.
Elena Aston, RBC. I'm also a member of the DSAP.
Joseph Korean with the Ontario Ministry of Economic Development, Job Creation and Trade, Digital Technologies Unit.
I'm Alex McDonough, part of the SWERN team.
Jordan Prockby, Director at PwC, and I lead our national privacy practice.
Oliver Koderman, partner, PwC.
Anayat Singh with the Distribution and Grid Modernization Team with the Ministry of Energy.
Lisa Austin, University of Toronto Faculty of Law.
Rose Langhout, I'm with the Information and Information Technology Group in the Ontario Government.
I'm Natasha Javakoglu. I'm with the City of Toronto Information and Technology Division.
Dash Aldronic, I'm with ISAD Privacy and Data Protection.
Hi, Natasha Polonova with the Toronto Region Board of Trade. I'm part of the policy team, and I also run the Smart Cities Working Group.
I'm Matthew Wheatley. I'm part of the swearing team today.
Oliver Hurley with the Waterfront BIA.
I'm Mike Noble. I'm with the City of Toronto's Waterfront Secretariat.
Kevin Tour, I'm with Communitech, and I also serve on the Digital Strategy Advisory Panel.
Yuta Tovranos, and Inclusive Design Research Center, and I'm also on the Digital Strategy Advisory Panel.
Claire Lempereur, I'm part of swearing team.
Kathleen Koth, Director of Transactive Energy at Peak Power.
Mike Shaver, CTO at Integrate AI.
Andre James, Ministry of Infrastructure.
Will Sutter, Ministry of Infrastructure.
Adrian Liu, Ministry of Infrastructure.
Shireen Abdelhamid, Research Analyst with Ontario Centers of Excellence.
Rosemary Freya, activist, videographer, journalist today.
Joe Greenwood, Mars Discovery District.
Michael Geist, Chair of the DSAP.
Andrew Satterthwaite, York Region Data and Analytics Group.
Nancy Faraday-Smith, Infrastructure Canada.
Jackie Lee with Nicole's team.
Courtney Doagu, Postdoctoral Fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation.
Jen Rees-Jones with the Information and Privacy Commissioner of Ontario.
Vance Lockton, as of next Monday, with Waterfront Toronto.
Michael Wolf, with Waterfront Toronto.
Ed Chalupka, Waterfront Toronto.
Lee Rose Mercader, Waterfront Toronto.
Christina Werner, Waterfront Toronto.
Crystal Dean with Civic Labs and Public Engagement, just here to observe.
Kevin Stolaric, I'm with the Inclusive Design Research Center at OCAD.
Chris Loken, CTO at Compute Ontario.
John Lawrence, Basic Magazine.
Yulia Pak was the swearing team.
Jerry Brown, interested member of the public.
Andrew Tumulty, Waterfront Toronto.
Harry Ainley, Waterfront Toronto.
Last but not least, thanks for your patience up at the front. There you go.
I'm Pam Ryan from Toronto Public Library.
Elena Novas with TELUS.
Tom Du with the Ministry of Energy.
Yeah, Chris Wilshire, I'm with the Communitech.
So one of the things we always try and emphasize is the value of having such a range of opinion in the room. One of the great burdens and opportunities of working in the public interest is trying to find common ground among multiple points of view, if there is any to be found, which I think there likely is plenty based on how the first Civic Lab went. So I'm going to call Christina Werner up to the front. She's got a few slides to go through and includes a reflection on what we heard last time and what has happened as a result of that feedback. So Christina, we'll hand it over to you. And if you don't mind hanging on with any questions until the presentations are complete, we'll make sure we have plenty of time to make our way around the room.
Great, thanks, Nicole. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us at the second Civic Lab in the series being offered by Waterfront Toronto. These Civic Labs are one way that we are exploring the key civic, digital issues and policy issues related to the revitalization work that is currently underway on Toronto's waterfront. We are guided in this work by expert committees and advisors, including our Digital Strategy Advisory Panel, all three levels of government, as well as continuous, ongoing public consultation. Today's conversation will focus on the considerations surrounding a digital stewardship body for Quayside. We are pleased to host this conversation with you and discuss potential digital stewardship models that could apply to the project. This conversation is an evolution of the earlier exploration of the concept of a civic data trust, which has been identified as one potential governance solution to an emerging smart neighborhood in Toronto's waterfront. Since our first Civic Lab this past November, we have worked with the Mars Solutions Lab to develop a data trust primer, which benefited from the input from many of you in this room and many others. Our goal for this primer was to provide additional insight into the concepts and approaches that could be relevant to our local context and create a resource that would be broadly accessible to others interested in this topic. In addition, the Toronto Region Board of Trade published the Bibliothèque Report, which presented an alternative approach to governance, placing the Toronto Public Library at the core of the solution. Other conversations have yielded approaches placing government as the trust, hub, or repository body with enhanced enforcement mechanisms. The province of Ontario has also begun their data strategy consultation, and the City of Toronto has recently passed a resolution calling for the CIO's office to lead a citywide public consultation to gather input on what the new data governance principles for smart cities should be. It's been a busy few months. There are a number of viable approaches that we want to explore with these and a broader group to help identify potential path forward that we can highlight to our government stakeholders, with ideas that respect the jurisdiction of each of the governments and builds on the existing regulatory environment rather than attempting to duplicate or unnecessarily replace aspects that are already working well. Regardless of the recommended path, there are several items that need to be considered to ensure that the governance of the digital layer addresses who decides what data may be collected, what data itself may be collected and shared, with whom, for what purposes, and also ensuring security, privacy, equity, and competitiveness for Canadian companies. Before we get started, I'd like to spend a few minutes reviewing Waterfront Toronto's role and where we are in the process for the Quayside project. Waterfront Toronto is working to revitalize the lands by Lake Ontario, transforming past industrial sites into thriving neighborhoods that support economic vitality and enhance quality of life. Our mandate comes from the three orders of government. Our resources come from both public and private sources. As we work on behalf of Torontonians, Ontarians, and Canadians, every decision we make is guided by our vision of one vibrant waterfront that belongs to everyone. In addition to our more traditional urban revitalization mandate, Waterfront Toronto has also historically had a strong commitment to sustainability and innovation. Our Resilience and Innovation Framework sets out our values and practices in these areas. The framework includes a detailed action plan for how technologies could be used to support community needs and improve quality of life. Now, through the Quayside project, this aspect of our mandate has been amplified with increased media and civic interest. It is important for us all to remember that this project is not progressing in a vacuum, and neither Waterfront Toronto nor Sidewalk Labs is able to create policy. Waterfront Toronto sees a key part of our role as convening conversations to tackle important topics that have been on the periphery of community building for decades. I am pleased to see that our government stakeholders are here with us today, since they have a critical role, and in many cases the ultimate responsibility for resolving these challenges. Ensuring that there is an appropriate comprehensive policy framework and regulatory regime is critical for smart city developments, not just here in Toronto, but across Canada. I also wanted to take a few moments to recap some of what we heard at the first Civic Lab. Participants said to broaden the participation of the private sector and civic technologists. We acted on this and extended additional invitations and are happy to see more people here today representing these groups. Participants said to leverage the experience of others. We have presenters here today that will draw on a vast array of experiences, including Dr. Austin with the global context, and Kevin Tour, who will explain the open data landscape, how it functions, and how it relates to potential stewardship body, and of course, our partners in the development of the primer, the Mars Solutions Lab. Participants also said that public education is key, and Waterfront Toronto is continuing to roll out the information sheets as part of a series of accessible communication pieces, and are in the midst of organizing a large-scale public meeting dedicated exclusively to digital issues. This will take place in the spring. Participants said it's important to discuss digital governance, and Waterfront Toronto is hosting this discussion today and is committed to convening future sessions on these topics, including our next Civic Lab, which will be held at the end of March, focused on IP, data monetization, and shared benefits. Participants said that it's important to stay rooted in the strong principles, and we are pleased to provide you with a glimpse of the principles that we are committed to. And today we'll be looking specifically at those around privacy. The Civic Labs are an important opportunity to help inform Waterfront Toronto's broader approach. As public stewards of the waterfront, we need to ensure that any projects that are progressing are doing so in a manner consistent with public interest. When Sidewalk Labs puts forward their proposal in their Master Innovation and Development Plan, Waterfront Toronto is committed to a rigorous evaluation process that will involve leading subject matter experts and a due diligence panel. We will seek public input on the MIDP through Waterfront Toronto-led consultations. This plan will be reviewed by all levels of government, the Waterfront Toronto Board of Directors, and if approved, any MIDP proposals will be subject to all federal and provincial regulations as well as municipal planning approvals. To be clear, any individual component selected for implementation at Quayside will be subject to all applicable laws from all levels of government. The goals that we set for Quayside are about using innovation and new ideas to deliver a better, more affordable quality of life. Protecting data and privacy are integral to the realization of these goals. However, if the MIDP proposed by Sidewalk Labs does not deliver on the priority objectives or does not speak to the protection of privacy, data, or digital rights in a manner that is in the public interest, when the proposed plan will not be approved by Waterfront Toronto and will not be implemented. We have been refining a base set of principles to govern our intelligent community work on the waterfront, including principles centered on the ethical use of technology, accountability and transparency, privacy, and the shared benefits of data and infrastructure. These draft principles will be going to our Digital Strategy Advisory Panel for feedback at their April meeting and be part of our digital consultation with the community in May. In late February, Waterfront Toronto had the opportunity to appear before the Standing Committee on Access to Information, Privacy, and Ethics. At this session, we were able to share with the committee some of our commitments that have been made regarding the protection of privacy in our efforts. While Canada's privacy laws relative to the rest of the world have proven remarkably effective, we recognize that technology is changing all the time, requiring Canadian privacy law to evolve. Waterfront Toronto is approaching our intelligent community initiatives, and specifically Quayside, with an expectation of the protection of the fundamental right of privacy, well beyond the strict letter of the law. We know that if this project is going to proceed, it must reflect Canadian values on privacy. I am pleased to be able to share with you an overview of these commitments today. 1. In addition to all existing legislative and regulatory requirements, we are committed to the principles of privacy by design. A plan for Quayside would only be approved if it adheres to these principles. 2. With respect to the protection of personal information, there will be no preferential treatment to any alphabet company, including Google, regarding linking to, sharing, or use of personal data. 3, data cannot be used for advertising purposes without express positive consent. 4, any personal information will be de-identified at source unless express consent is knowingly and explicitly given for a specific purpose. 5, minimization of data collection is essential so that only the data needed and identified for a limited and specified purpose would be collected. And 6, our commitment is that data collected for the Quayside project will be stored in Canada. Sidewalk Labs has already committed to abiding by all of these key requirements. We agree with what Dr. Ann Kavukian has often said. We are looking to create a smart city of privacy on Toronto's waterfront, and we are firmly committed to working with our government stakeholders to ensure that this is precisely what is delivered. To help frame our conversation today, we have created an urban digital ecosystem map that begins to identify, maybe, if it can click. Thanks. Sorry, these aren't the right slides. Harry? There we go. Perfect, okay. So this urban digital ecosystem map that begins to identify, in a non-Quayside specific manner, key actors in smart city projects. The ecosystem explores both public and private parties that traditionally engage in these projects, including governments, public agencies, civil society, individual members of the public, and private actors ranging from telecom providers to infrastructure providers. While we also have a detailed map that we're working through specific to Quayside, in order to advance our conversation without debating the merits of one specific proposed solution for Quayside, I would like to walk through a map using a series of examples that I was involved with during my time in Windsor, Essex, which started down the path of a smart community development project back in 1999. So if we can advance to the next slide. In the case of Windsor, Essex, the University of Windsor was uniquely positioned to perform the function of digital steward on behalf of many of the actors in the region, including all of the local municipalities, school boards, hospitals, and other public agencies, for example, tourism, economic development, and community health, through their Center for Smart Community Innovation, where I had the pleasure of serving for 13 years. The stakeholders created a joint venture entity known as WEDNet, or later Connecting Windsor-Essex, which owned and operated key digital infrastructure, including data storage, security devices, portal technologies, a distributed identity management solution, and network technologies, and operated as the local regional advanced network and point of presence for the Ontario Research and Innovation Optical Network and CANet4. Where there were fringes on the policy frontier, this consortium engaged the broader public sector to draft the governance documents and protocols regarding the use of these assets on behalf of the entire region. In many cases, these obligations were enforced through contract. The body was governed by a representative board and was fully self-sustaining, with revenues being provided by the stakeholders on an equity model of cost recovery. Our group facilitated the deployment of rural broadband, while also serving, if you will, as the Costco for connectivity, negotiating bulk discounts and maintaining key contracts and warranty obligations on behalf of all of the stakeholders. The group also monitored the infrastructure, maintained device registries, and enforced compliance on all of the acceptable use policies and service level agreements. So if you look at this particular scenario, you'll see that you had all of the municipalities, all the school boards, the hospitals, and so on. And if I was to walk through any one particular application, you would see how each of those actors were actually invoked for various different roles. So in the case, for instance, we had an asthma research project that we were involved with, which was a predictive model around asthma care where it would make recommendations for patient care. Our request for service actually came from, don't laugh, but the group in Windsor was called WEASN, the Windsor-Essex Asthma Strategy Network. Very appropriate. But the WEASN group came to the University of Windsor and asked if there was something that we might be able to do. And now this is back in 2003 maybe, so well before AI was a really big thing. And we were actually able to take and create a knowledge base based on 200 standards of care from local physicians who are put into a large database, and then patients were actually able to come and see an asthma educator at a primary care physician's office and take their treatment map from this asthma educator where the information was being sent to a respirologist overnight and start getting treatment within 48 hours, as opposed to waiting for 8 to 12 weeks to actually see the respirologist for their first appointment. And that was on a good day. Most of the time, that waiting period was around 8 to 12 months. So in this case, you actually had WEASN invoking sort of the specifications. The university did all of the programming based on the knowledge base gleaned from our physicians. TELUS and Cogeco were providing elements of the telecommunications pieces. Our university network was actually doing all of the identity management on the system. We had IBM Canada engaged with some of the actual development of the database components of it. But ultimately, we were required at the university to hold the data, program all of the interfaces, maintain the registries of all the spirometry equipment, make sure everything was actually working and up and supported for all of the respirology clinicians as well as all the asthma educators, and also produce all of the reports that were going back to the Ontario Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care. So it was a very robust kind of role for the university to play. And that would be, I would think, one of the more high-risk kind of situations where we had, because it was patient healthcare data that was actually going back and forth on the network, we had dozens of examples of how we were actually able to use this infrastructure and the governance model we put into place to deliver high-quality, smart community type of applications in a very quick and easy, lightweight way that saved money for all of our local governments and stakeholders, and also ensured the security of the infrastructure that was in place, because there was sort of this very centralized group of people that were focused on this infrastructure and all the policy pieces to it. As we work together today to advance the notion of the potential data stewardship model for Quayside, there are several issues that we will need to consider. Things like, who is going to run it? Which architecture model is desirable? How and where will the data be stored? What policies and regulations will govern it? What is the best legal construct for this body? What is its legal authority? How does it relate to government and existing regulators? Are there any changes recommended for these adjacent bodies? How will it be funded? How will it be sustained? How can we learn from global best practices to inform how we should move forward? Over the past year, we have conducted broad conversations to help raise ideas and concerns of Torontonians as Sidewalk Labs prepares their Master Innovation and Development Plan for our consideration. Thousands of people have participated in the consultation process to date, and we intend to hear from thousands more before we finish this stage of the journey. We expect to receive the first draft of the MIDP in the coming months. It will be made available for public input, and once Waterfront Toronto has conducted its independent public consultation, we will then begin the evaluation process. Waterfront Toronto will continue to work with federal, provincial, and municipal policymakers to ensure the public is well served. In light of all of this, and based on the presentations that you are about to hear, I ask that you please share your advice with us to help frame what a data stewardship body for Quayside could be, both in terms of form and function. Technology and its impact on cities raises questions that are being debated around the world. These conversations, and leveraging Quayside as a proof point, is an excellent opportunity for Canada to get these answers in a tangible way. Thank you.
Michael Noble, City of Toronto Waterfront Secretariat.
Hi there. Yes, as Nicole said, I'm Mike Noble. I'm with the City of Toronto's Waterfront Secretariat. Also joined, as you heard today, by several colleagues from both the City of Toronto and the Province of Ontario and Government of Canada. So I'm the only one of us all who are speaking, so I wish you welcome on behalf of all the governments. And as you know, the city and federal and provincial governments, through a coordinating body that we call the Waterfront Revitalization Initiative Intergovernmental Steering Committee, are closely monitoring this project. Speaking on behalf of the city, as Sidewalk Labs has been developing their Master Innovation and Development Plan, city staff from many divisions have been providing preliminary input to the process with the purpose of encouraging proposals that reflect city goals, policies, and regulations. Eventually, when Sidewalk Labs and Waterfront Toronto present the MIDP to the city, staff from many divisions will undertake a comprehensive review of the document. And that will include staff from many divisions, including the Chief Information Officer and City Clerk. We'll analyze the desirability of the various proposals, as well as the regulatory and City Council approvals that will be required for any future implementation. And this evaluation process will include city-led public and stakeholder meetings. Following this, we'll prepare a report for the committee and City Council with an analysis of the plan and with associated recommendations. As you may know, last week city staff received direction from Council to develop a citywide policy framework and governance model associated with digital infrastructure and a citywide public consultation process to inform the implementation of that plan and to be applied to Quayside and other smart city developments. So we're currently working to move forward this direction, and the result of this work and these focused data governance consultations will also inform the city's response to the Master Innovation Development Plan. City Council's consideration of the MIDP would represent just one step of a larger review process, as Christina noted, which if pursued would include various application and evaluation processes, each with their own opportunities for public input and their own requirements for council approval. For example, some proposals would probably require public development applications under the Planning Act. That's just one example. So we would anticipate a staff report coming to committee possibly at the end of this year, more likely in 2020. Then this will depend on the schedule of Sidewalk Labs and Waterfront Toronto. Thank you.
Okay, so Lisa and Kevin are up next, really talking about the digital stewardship body models and learnings from other jurisdictions. So Lisa, come on up, and Kevin shortly after.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me here today. I'm thrilled Waterfront Toronto is convening this discussion. I think that, to echo Michael's comments earlier, there's a lot of opportunity here to think creatively about interesting models for data governance in this space. And there's a rapidly growing discussion of data trusts internationally. And I think it's at the confluence of a number of trends that are important for then understanding kind of how this discussion is unfolding. So one is the desire for greater access to data, the sharing of data sets, especially in the era of AI. So this is a huge driver. Another one is the growing concerns about privacy, but also, I think importantly, data governance concerns that go far beyond a model of individual privacy. So there's the, how do we protect privacy? And then there's a whole set of emerging considerations that many people would say are not really captured by the paradigm of privacy. And what do we do about that? And then I think in the urban context, there's this kind of, emerging fast-flowing discussion about, cities being an interesting site of new thinking regarding democratic participation, citizenship in the development context. And so in all of these different trends, and I'm sure people in the room can identify even more than what I've just said, you see the term data trust coming up as a solution to issues around data governance. And there's a lot of excitement, but turns out not necessarily a lot of clarity. And so what I thought I'd do, I think the primer that was circulated has a great set of specific examples to take a look at, but what I wanted to do is talk about them in relation to kind of three very basic questions that I think are important to think about when we think about the different models and evaluate them and whether they can migrate globally as well and be solutions for us. And the questions are very, very simple. One is just what is a data trust? The second is what's the problem to which a data trust is the solution? And third, what's the basis for enforcement and oversight? And I think that the first two, the what is a data trust and what's the problem to which a data trust is a solution, it's interesting to kind of be clear about this because I worry sometimes that when we're in a big room and we all say data trust, I'm excited about it, and I'm actually really excited about the idea. Are we actually all agreeing on anything? Or am I thinking that, well, my data trust is model A and it's a response to problem X, and your version of a data trust is model B and it's a response to problem Z, and actually we're not agreeing on anything, we're just using the same word. And I think that's a huge problem, potential problem and pitfall in this area. And then I think the basis for enforcement and oversight is an important question. It's an important question when we're looking to migrate models from other jurisdictions because the law is different in different jurisdictions. And part of some of the problems to which a data trust can be a solution for can be legal problems. And so we have to be careful about that and the migrating of that. And I think also the issue about enforcement and oversight is really important to kind of dig a little bit deeper in than maybe the discussion has been so far. Because if it turns out we all decide there's an agreement on a model, but it's actually difficult to implement with actual oversight, it becomes kind of an aspirational model or a statement of principles that we can't actually enforce legally, then there's going to be a practical push towards adopting something else that perhaps isn't going to solve the problem we want to solve. Okay, so I'll just kind of go through these questions and talk a little more concretely about them quickly. So what is a data trust? Data trusts mean lots of different things. I don't think it's the case that there are just different implementations of the same thing. I think we're talking about different things in a lot of different contexts. And the way I try to kind of parse this when I look at the different models is I think that they're reflecting different meanings of the word trust. So one set of the meanings of the word trust is, you believe in the reliability of something. So we can have trusted technologies, we can have trusted decision makers, and then there's another meaning, right? The legal trust meaning, which is often kind of invoked, sometimes rather metaphorically. Sometimes people mean a real legal trust in this context. Okay, and they're different things. So what's a legal trust? In a legal trust, the trustees manage the trust assets on behalf of the beneficiaries. They owe a fiduciary obligation to the beneficiaries, and the beneficiaries can enforce this in court. There are also purpose trusts. We have charitable purpose trusts, and we have non-charitable purpose trusts, although most jurisdictions don't allow non-charitable purpose trusts. There are some exceptions. One of them that's really interesting, I think, if you talk about the legal trust model internationally, the one example that keeps coming up is Guernsey data trusts. Guernsey trust law allows for non-charitable purpose trusts. And I think that the legal trust model is really interesting. I'm quite taken with this model, though I'm going to raise a couple questions about it, is because you have this feature of fiduciary obligation owed to beneficiaries. And so if you think of the beneficiaries as the public in some space, then you think that, okay, it's the beneficiaries have an ownership interest. They have what in law we call the beneficial ownership. And there's this fiduciary obligation that's enforceable. So it seems very attractive. You have the public who can like own data and enforce obligations in relation to it. That sounds pretty darn good. There are problems though. Okay, so that's a legal trust model. Then we use the word trust for trusted decision makers. So this is like when we use it in contexts like school board trustees, or at the last meeting that was held on data trust, the example of the BC's island trusts came out, where you have trust councils and local trust committees that manage the lands at issue. When in that context, they're corporations, actually, so it's not a legal trust model. It's a corporate form. Other forms, like aspects of the Barcelona models, there's lots of talk, and in the primer, there is discussions of some of the examples coming out of Barcelona, very interesting space. A lot of that is more about, situating decision-making within a municipality in a kind of public agency or committee kind of focus. So those aren't legal trusts, but they're more around trusted decision makers, and you're worried about, who makes the decisions and how those decisions are governed. And then there's the trusted technologies. And there's a lot of examples of these also in the primer, where these are technological platforms for data sharing. And so you want to create a platform for data sharing that permits this, subject to the applicable legal obligations, like the privacy rules. This is the use of data trust, in my opinion, in the recent UK report, Growing the Artificial Intelligence Industry in the UK, right? One of the 3 main recommendations from that report was the development of data trusts to improve trust and ease around sharing data. Very much about creating technological platforms to reduce complexities, right? Even if the law allows you to share data and you're going to conform with privacy regulations, there are all sorts of legal and technical complexities to work through. So it's about creating platforms that ease that and allow you to scale that. There's a lot of interesting work going on around that in the research space too, in the university space. But again, that's not a legal trust. Right? That's creating trusted technological solutions that reduce the complexities around sharing data. Okay. So I think there are these different uses of trust: legal trust, trusted decision makers, trusted technologies, and the different models that we see kind of grab aspects of these. Okay, so which do we want to use? It depends on the problem to which the data trust is seen to be a solution. So if you want to facilitate data sharing consistent with existing privacy law, you're probably going to focus more on the trusted technologies models, because that's going to solve that problem for you, right? And so, which is fine. But there are some other problems to which the data trust might be the solution, some of which came up, I thought, strongly in the last data trust workshop that I attended here. So you might think that there are substantive inadequacies and gaps in Canadian privacy law. If you think that, then focusing simply on technological platforms that reduce complexities for data sharing consistent with existing privacy law, that's not going to do it for you, because you're going to say, well, actually, there's really important gaps and problems with existing Canadian privacy law, whether it's at the provincial level or the federal level. This is a real problem for us, I think, because I'm sure everyone in the room is thinking, oh my God, but we can't do law reform, we'll never get anything off the ground. And I share that cringe. But this is a problem. So if you think that, is there a way, I think it's an interesting question. I think this is one of the opportunities here. Is there a way in which you can kind of craft some other model that allows you to get around some of these problems without going down that full route of law reform? I don't know. And some of these are problems with, investigatory and enforcement powers, the lack of anything around algorithmic fairness and transparency, ongoing questions about the intersection with state surveillance, and, we could all put our list there. But just a note of caution, so when we look at other international models, so for example, as I said, Barcelona is like the place where everyone's sort of looking for really interesting kind of examples of what's going on. But if we're sitting here and saying part of what we need to do for a project like Sidewalk Toronto is solve the problem that our existing legal framework, while we need to comply with it, we want to go beyond it because there are gaps and inadequacies, then, and sometimes people are saying, well, those gaps and inadequacies, if we only had the GDPR, we'd be great. You might not agree with that, but if that's what you're thinking, Barcelona is in a framework of the GDPR. Right? So you have to be careful of just saying, let's do what they're doing. if part of what you want to do is address the inadequacies of the law when they don't face the same inadequacies, right? You have to diagnose that problem, I think, carefully. And I think that is one of the problems facing here, which is how do we address the fact that I think the regulatory framework is inadequate. It's a good start, but it's inadequate. So those are the privacy aspects. And then there's this growing global discussion about non-privacy aspects around data governance. And the public interest in relation to data. So issues around group surveillance, human rights, equality concerns, data ethics more generally, data monopolies, non-corporate governments, technological sovereignty, smart citizenship, et cetera, right? There's a whole, and I'm sure many people here can add to that list. It's a very exciting space if you're an academic. I'm sure if you have to make a decision right now and you need to take into consideration some of this, maybe less exciting. But there's a whole set of non-privacy aspects of the public interest in related to data. Again, if you think that that's the issue that needs to be solved, then focusing solely on models that are around solving the complexities around data sharing consistent with existing privacy legislation is just not going to be the right model, right? And if we're all in a room where some people are saying, well, that's the issue to solve, and so here's the model, and someone else is like, no, 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 it's the non-privacy aspects that we need to deal with. We need a different model, but we all come out of this saying, yeah, we all agree we need a data trust. We haven't agreed on anything. Last important set of questions is, what's the basis for enforcement and oversight? Because I think this is really important for public buy-in to anything that comes out of an exercise like this. And so if you're focused on things like trusted technologies, and I think there's a lot to focus on there, there's a lot that we can do in that space. But it might be then that if you think that what the issue is trusted technologies in relation to existing privacy laws, then we already have enforcement and oversight, right? We have a whole regulatory infrastructure, and so you really can just focus on that reducing complexity bit. And there's a lot to be done there. But if you think we need to fill gaps, if you think we need to go beyond existing legal obligations, then I think there's a real serious question, but also I'd like to say opportunity to think about how do we do that so that we get enforceable obligations instead of mere statements of aspirations, right? We don't just want statements of principles. We don't just want ethical aspirations. We want, I think, enforceable obligations if you want the public to kind of buy into this. So how do we do that? I think that's an open question. There's lots of different models. But I'll just say a couple things about, I think that is why people are drawn to the legal trust model. And so I just wanted to raise a couple cautionary tales about the legal trust model. So the reason it's a good model and intriguing in this space is it's a creature of private law, right? So you don't need to do the whole law reform process. You can create an enforceable fiduciary obligation, and so you can, build into the trust some of these obligations that we don't exist otherwise in the law, and it looks like you can create an enforceable mechanism to do so. Right, and there's other models too. We might want to talk about like how you do that through a nonprofit corporation, or right, there's other sorts of ways in which we might think about this. But on the legal trust note, again, it depends on what the legal framework is, and there are some real questions about whether you could create a legal trust around data in this kind of civic space. And so I'm just going to flag two and just talk a little bit about some of the international differences. So one is that one of the requirements for a trust is that the asset that will be governed in the trust is a proprietary interest. So trusts are basically a way of owning something, and you split the ownership between the trustees and the beneficiaries. So there's this idea that it has to be a proprietary interest. The orthodox legal position is data is not property. So there's IP protections, they're limited. Teresa Scaza, who's not here, has a great paper about that scopes some of this out. Some other jurisdictions where we see data trusts, like Guernsey, have more IP available to them than we do. They have database protection in Europe that we don't have here. Guernsey also has some image protection. Anyway, so they have rights that we don't have here. Some jurisdictions have even said confidential business information is not proprietary enough for a trust. So Singapore Court of Appeal said that. So there's a real problem right from the start. And that was confidential business information. Urban data in a civic trust that's being shared with everyone isn't confidential business information. So there's an issue there that would need to get worked through. Unclear if you could do that without some legislation. The other thing is that, a number of colleagues I've spoken with about this say, you're not setting up a regular legal trust. It sounds like a purpose trust, right? That this is about governing data for purposes, public interest purposes of certain sorts. So there's two ways you can do that. You can create a charitable purpose trust or a non-charitable purpose trust. Charitable purpose trusts are tricky. There's like strict rules about what constitutes a charity. It doesn't just mean that it's in the public interest. And it's not clear that when you have this kind of commercial activity that's going to be fostered by something like this, that you're going to fit within the charitable purpose trust rules. Non-charitable purpose trusts, tricky to set up. I won't get into the weird legal minutiae in Ontario about that, but the basic problem with a non-charitable purpose trust is an enforcement problem. Again, some jurisdictions, like Guernsey, have changed their trust law. You can create a non-charitable purpose trust in Guernsey, and you can designate someone as an enforcer, and so you have a third party that enforces the trust. So there are ways in which you could create these models, but I think you might need, again, enabling legislation, which takes us back to the problem that started this, which is we have an inadequate regulatory framework, and we're looking for ways around that get us enforceable obligations. And it's very tricky. I don't have an answer to any of that, but I think that's part of where this discussion has to start going, which is, if you think that at least part of what has to happen here is to deal with the inadequacies of the regulatory framework, how do you do that in a way that actually makes these obligations enforceable in some kind of manner that the public will buy into? And that's a challenge. Thank you.
Kevin Tour's up next, and he's from Communitech, going to talk about open data process and landscape.
Excellent, thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to talk about some work that we've been doing for the last number of years around open data. And specifically, some of the work that we've been doing as part of Canada's Open Data Exchange, which has been an initiative that we've been working on for about the last 4 years. And the whole purpose of the Open Data Exchange was to move beyond the conversation of using open data as a mechanism for transparency and open government, and moving it towards the conversation towards how can the private sector and the end user community use open data for driving outcomes like economic outcomes and things of that sort. So what I want to do in the next 10, 15 minutes is just go through some things that we've learned as a part of our journey and see how they might relate to the Data Trusts Initiative, because I think there are a lot of transferable lessons that we can glean from this. And so I'm going to take you through a little bit of what we've learned and bring it around at the end. But I'm going to talk a little bit specifically about open data itself. So for those of you, you probably are quite aware what open data is. It's defined as structured data that is machine readable, freely shared, used and built without restrictions. So in a sense, it's a free resource. The notion being that the majority, I think, of open data that we perceive today comes from government sources, be it municipal, provincial, or federal. But there's no obligation for it to be so. Open data can come from the private sector and from other sources as well. But a great amount of the work that's been done out there has really been focused on open data as a government resource and how that can provide value and specifically transparency. The open data, I mean, obviously, if we look at data as a whole as a generic asset, and I wanted to borrow this data spectrum from the Open Data Institute. And for those of you who are not familiar with Open Data Institute in the UK, they are a leading authority on open data and data innovation in general. And certainly I know over the course of the number of years that we've been working on open data, we've certainly been following their progress and the kinds of activities that they've been progressing on. And one of the things is, is bringing around the notion of the data spectrum. And of course, on the far right-hand side is where we see the open data, where it's very open. It's governed typically by an open license. And there are certain characteristics that go along with that. But we can also appreciate that data can exist at the other end of the spectrum and basically anywhere along the spectrum. And I think why this matters is because obviously, if we're looking at more proprietary data at the other end of the spectrum, then the rules of governance, the rules by which we engage, which we share, and which we use is much different. And I think where data trust, where it becomes significantly more difficult and more involved, is the fact that a data trust theoretically can be comprised of data anywhere in this spectrum. And I think that's something, and if I look at what we're doing with the Waterfront Toronto project, I think we see that as an opportunity, is it's not just open data or data that's generated for the open realm, but it's also data that could come from private sector sources or other sources, of which by combining we can gain certain value out of that. So in terms of where we've come over the last 4 years in terms of the landscape, and I'd say this is predominantly targeted at what we've seen in Canada, but perhaps we see similar sorts of trends globally. Certainly back when we started the circuit around open data was thought of this resource that was, again, for the purposes of illustrating or providing transparency, typically around government and government operations. And arguably, you know, you could say that this was developed for a civic good. It's, again, for creating that transparency and creating that awareness about what's going on. But now what we're hearing is that it's more of the publish with purpose, meaning the notion being the notion of transparency in open government is in itself well-intentioned, but there are challenges that come along with this, and a big part of that is the sustainability model. How do we create this as a sustainable asset? And so now we're seeing the conversation not just publish at will, let's not mark necessarily our progress by the number of data sets that are made open and available on open data portals. It's about what's the data that we should be making available, what's the value that's being provided out of that. And certainly the whole notion of open by default. So we know that I believe the City of Toronto is governed by open by default, and I know the provinces as well, and the feds have piling in it. But it's the notion that we start the conversation around opening data with it's going to be open, and we have to make the case to not open it. And the nuance there is that it forces us to think about the value, and it forces us to think of the use cases and why, why we should be locking it down instead of opening it up. Because this is really built on the premise that the more data that's out there, it's going to fuel better decision making, it's going to fuel innovation, it's going to fuel more transparency. So we really are driving towards making as much data available as we can. And of course, what's changed over the course of the last 4 years, even though AI and machine learning have been around since I went to grad school, and believe me, that was a number of years ago. At that time, it was considered more artificial than intelligent, but now we are actually getting to artificial intelligence that's providing value. And where sometimes, and surprisingly so, where the nuance is lost is the fact that it takes good data to program and to drive good artificial intelligence. It truly is that garbage in and garbage out. So this is really changing the landscape when it comes to open data and the availability of data in general. So really what it is, from an open data perspective, is it really is a supply chain issue. Because we've got one side of the supply chain that's worried about things like privacy and prioritization and having the resources available to make open data available. And then you've got the demand side of the user side that are troubled with finding the data, or the discovery piece, and finding, standards so that data sets of common data sets are governed by a common data standard. So regardless of the source, then you can ingest it easily. And the quality, of course, is a big issue. But the biggest single thing that we've learned over the course of 4 years in dealing with both the supply side, namely government, and the demand side, namely the private sector, is this whole notion, and it's extremely fundamental, is you've got one side that's saying, well, what data do they want? And you've got the other side saying, well, what data do they have? So in some cases, it's really a communications issue more than anything. And it's about bringing together the stakeholders in a fashion so that they can have meaningful conversations and they can derive strong value propositions that makes it sustainable from all perspectives. So I'm going to focus now for the next couple of slides on the Government of Canada's policies. So I wanted to talk a little bit about, how are they approaching open data? And these are Canada's open data principles. And they're based on Sunlight Foundations, who are an organization out of the US that's done a lot of work around open data. So these are the kinds of things, and this is where the government of Canada use these principles to guide their own internal open data activities. And I'm not going to go through and explain every single one of them, but I mean, all of these are very relevant issues that need to be considered as part of creating data, open data portals, and I would argue as a data trust as well. And these are, it's not like, you can select a subset of these and ignore a subset of the others. I think it's one of these things where the government of Canada in particular said, we need to pay attention to all of these particular issues in order to make this function, to make this work properly. And in addition to that, they're working off of a guidebook that they've put together. And this speaks to the process by which organizations or groups within government would actually work through the process of defining open data that would make available and the process by which they do that. And again, this is, a lot of time and effort has gone into building these policies and these guidebooks. And I would say that this is if nothing else, this is a good place or a good baseline to start from when we start thinking about the evolution of the open data portal, maybe being the Civic Data Trust, and really what needs to be done in order to make sure we create a proper workflow so that we get the asset and the resource out there, but we do it in such a way that we protect privacy, we protect those that are potentially could be harmed by a poor implementation. So part of what we did as well as ODX is we did a cross-Canada tour, and we spoke to a number of companies, and we spoke to a number of mostly municipalities and cities, and asked them what their challenges are with dealing with open data and getting access to open data. And again, I'm not going to go through each and every one of these, but again, some of these are fairly fundamental. And what we found is, again, going back to the communications issue, that these top 7 issues that I've listed here are from a demand-side perspective. So this is from the user side, and these are the kinds of challenges that they're facing, and these are the recommendations that companies are making to government to make their data more consumable and more usable. So if you build that and if you align that over top of the guiding principles, then I think what you're starting to do is you're getting, first of all, at least some layer of overlap, which gives us hope that we're heading in the right direction and that there is an amenable solution. But it's also, what are the gaps that we need to fill and what are the gaps we need to consider? So this is very much a demand-side perspective. And the other thing I would point you to as part of a program we ran with ODX is we put some resources into the hands of some startups and scale-up companies who are either using data as part of their product or service that they're making or developing, or in striving in making data open and available. So some of these should look familiar to you. Hopefully they look familiar to you. But these are examples of real companies out there that are making value and making use out of an open data resource. And I think that's extremely important, because that leads me to my final slide in terms of how does then the whole open data movement and what we've learned about open data, how does that jive with Civic Data Trust, and what have we learned from it? And for me, first and foremost, it's about the purpose. And we've heard this a couple times already, is why are we doing this? What is the purpose of all of this? And I think we need to make sure that we stop talking in generalities and we start talking about what the purpose is in order to proceed forward as we build out these platforms or these processes or these procedures, because that's fundamental to all of it. And I would argue, and that's why I have the 2 asterisks beside it, is if we start there and only start there, I think everything below that I'm going to talk about will fall out of it. But things like privacy and security, for instance, obviously we have to pay attention to that, and we have to think about privacy by design, which we've already spoken about, and the issues around de-identification and the right to be forgotten and the things of that sort. So they can't be forgotten. We can't assume that they would take care of themselves. But again, what we're finding is that what we need to do is to make sure that we do these things concurrently. Data ownership and data sovereignty, even though in the open data side of things, I remember when we started Open Data Exchange, we thought we would host a number of open data sets and on our own site in order to get that out to the private sector. But it became very clear to us that the data owners wanted to own their data and they wanted to host it themselves. It brings them more control and gives them the ability to, make sure that they create a valuable resource. The other thing, what we've heard, stakeholder roles and engagement strategy. So because we are building a system that has the potential to engage a wide variety of stakeholders, again, we need to build a strategy around how to do that. Back again to the open data analogy, when we left it to the supply side, then it was about making as many data sets available in PDF format on a website, and that was measured as success. But of course, as somebody who wants to consume that, it makes it difficult and it erects barriers for actually unlocking the value for that. And it's the other part about that we need to talk about, of course, is governance. We've talked about governance already. A proper governance model is essential to making sure that stakeholders play nicely in this arena and make sure that we actually build something of value and resourcing it properly. And this is one of the things we've seen and heard on numerous occasions around open data, which could equivalently apply to data trust, is you need to resource the initiative properly. It can't be an initiative that lives off the side of someone's desk because it will not get the proper attention and it will not be built out appropriately. And finally, I want to leave you with the whole notion of sustainability. Because sometimes what happens is we get caught up in the technology, we get caught up in the potential that we forget about what we need to do is we need to make this sustainable so that it creates long-term benefit and effect. And that's what we've seen in terms of the evolution of open data. As I've mentioned, it's gone from the open government and transparency discussion to now publish with a purpose, with the notion of either you decide to make it available as a public good and you decide to fund it as such, or you find ways where which you can monetize the service or you can monetize the capabilities so as to make that a resource that's sustainable for the long term and the duration. So with that, I'm going to leave you with that, and I'll leave it there for now.
So thanks for your patience with any questions. Christina and Lisa and Kevin, hang around closer to the front. We've got a couple of mics, Nate and Harry. If you have any questions for any of our presenters, now's a good time to ask them. And before we move into some discussion. Of course, if you have none, we will move straight into some discussion of your thoughts about what you're hearing. I'm right here. Go ahead.
Hi, thanks. It's Yuta Tavranos from the Inclusive Design Research Center. And my question is, there are emerging in multiple places that face similar challenges, the notion of a data co-op. So ownership and governance of the data by the producers of the data with the ability to negotiate. And I understand it bridges between the legal trust and the various other trusts that were, and I wonder if there are any comments people could make on that.
Great. Harry, you want to, Lisa, are you, I'm going to, unless I see you eyeballing me, I'm going to take a wild one. Yeah, you want to respond?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think these are all really interesting models we need to think more about. And my questions I have more questions than answers, which is, how do you make those models work legally so that they're not just metaphors? Like, let's have a co-op as if we own this data when we don't have clear ownership rules around data legally in the first place, and we're creating all these like awkward ways of dealing with it. So I have some of the similar questions as I have with the legal trust, which is, in the abstract, it sounds really great. In certain circumstances, it might work, but that doesn't mean it's going to migrate into this particular circumstance without digging into those details a bit more.
And as with any of these forums, just because these are the three folks that were at the front of the room, and yes, it is an opportunity to ask them, I know very well that many of you might have answers to these questions too, so if you want to answer one of the questions, you don't have to only be our speakers. Stick your hand up and we'll make sure we move around the room.
Yeah, does the legal basis for the trust intersect with the financial model, or are they two orthogonal questions? And how are you going to fund it, and who's going to pay for this?
Oh, you mean who's going to fund it? Who's going to pay for it?
How does the legal basis, I think if I understood you well, intersect, if at all, with the financial basis for it? Is that what you were going with? Yeah. And I don't know if, it might be a piece of advice that it better if you don't have an answer. But Christina's right beside you too. Take a look and see if anybody else wants to weigh in. I really think we're treading on a lot of new territory. Do you want to respond at all?
I'm with Nicole, it better. So I think that the sustainability and the funding piece of it, it's one of those things that keeps coming up over and over again. Like, these are some really great ideas, and they're all coming about as a result of some of these new projects that are happening. What impetus do they actually have to help contributing to funding of these bodies as well, and what mechanisms need to be put in place? And it's all part of the conversation we're hoping to have today to sort of flesh that out as well.
So there's a hand up right there, and there's a mic right beside you. Go ahead.
Hi.
Carl, this one at the back. It should be on.
Is that on?
Is the switch on? Yeah. All right, we need all
It
of
is
them.
now.
Okay, take this.
So thanks. Joe Greenwood from Mars. Just on the data collaborative and some of the intersection model, when we're doing the primer research, then a lot of different discussions as to what those are, and it also gets tied to a bit of ownership model. So is it public versus private, and what's the financing behind that? And we'll get into some of this data, but a lot of it's very use case specific. It's going to be very dependent on the value of the data being exchanged. And different themes, and came out with some quite different conclusions in that area. And then on the cooperative model, a lot of that has, from the work we did, quick scan as a reference in one of the slides to that, a lot of them have been where private companies predominantly are trying to donate towards public good, has been the predominant use of that model. And they're trying to say collectively, we think we add to that.
Great. And it may be that through the presentations after the break, we get a little bit more detailed on some of these points. Any other questions? Oh, go ahead. John, right to your right.
Oh, great. Thanks so much. I think this is a question for Lisa, but anybody who wants to jump in, it would be helpful. I'm curious whether there's any evidence yet in the field of data around what in the environmental field often gets referred to as extra legislative enforcement. So, for example, the use of resources by forestry producers, forest products producers, is shifted and changed by expectations of a broad community of stakeholders, mainly consumers, but also other businesses, through a stand-in mechanism like a Forest Stewardship Council certificate. Now, it's by no means it's not globally successful in every case, but it is an example where there's no legal basis, but it works to some extent. Is it too early to say if there's an analogy in the data field?
Great question.
So I don't have a specific answer for that, except that I think that's how we need to start thinking. I mean, if you think the problem here in Canada is that the regulatory infrastructure is not strong enough for what the challenges are, that's my particular view, but it's not everybody's view. But you also think that the chances of broad law reform happening in the near future is non-existent. We need to have those creative discussions of, are there these other models? Are they going to be stopgap models, or maybe they'll just be like interesting models that we can export other places as well? So I think building more of those analogies and understanding how they may or may not work, and then drilling into the details of how they may or may not work is what we have to do instead of staying at such a broad general level of discussion here. If you're in agreement that there are these inadequacies. If you don't think that there are inadequacies, then it's a totally different conversation.
Okay, so what I'm going to suggest is we take the next 20 minutes, maybe 20, 25 minutes. If you're sitting with people you talk to every day and you want to move, there are some empty chairs around the room. You know who you are. If you want to stay where you are, go ahead. But what I'd like to suggest is that we start with a bit of whetting of your appetite to discussing what you have to share with Waterfront Toronto today in terms of any advice on how they think about a Quayside digital stewardship body. So it's very open. We heard co-op, we heard extra outside of the existing legislation. Are there stewardship models that might be interesting? Many people bring a different lens to this and have a different sense of these are the key points that you better cover when you're thinking it through. So I'm going to turn it over to you to discuss that with the people you're sitting with. We've got people at all the tables taking notes, or at least I think most of the tables. And I want to flag also that this is a resource not to be looked off. And Christina walked it through. In it, it describes the different actors that would be part of this ecosystem. This is definitely a draft. If there are people missing, add them. If there's a different lens through which you can think about these different actors, I encourage you to use this and take some notes on here if that helps your discussion, and we'll collect these and make sure they're part of our summary as well. So I'm going to leave it with you for about 20-25 minutes, and then I'm going to check in. We'll have a group discussion before we go to break at 3 o'clock. So over to you. Hi, everybody. We've got about 15 minutes before we're going to take a break. In a couple minutes, I'm going to move the mic around the room just to get a flavor of what you're talking about, like an appetizer for the after break. So in a couple minutes, if you wrap up your discussion, we'll move the mic around the room. I'm just going to, actually, that's not a bad idea. Don't overdo, don't overdo. Can you guys offer up? All right. We're going to have a full hour for, more than an hour for discussion after the break. So I'm just going to butt in here. Sorry about that. I know there's a lot of people in the throes of good conversations. But one of the benefits of having a group like this together is we try and find a bit of time to hear what other people are talking about at different tables. So up at the front here, we had a very rich discussion. These guys are going to start us off. We don't need a thesis of what you just spent half an hour discussing, but some highlights. So we get a flavor for how different people are thinking about it, and then you can take what you're hearing now into our discussion after the break.
Okay, thank you. I'll just give a few very high-level topics of our discussion. One was around regulatory and the three levels of government needing to work together so that we don't end up with silos and industry doesn't know how to work within it, as well as others. We have to look at the fundamentals. For example, is data a property? Is it ownable? And if so, what data is ownable? And the inevitability of this happening and this opportunity that we have with Sidewalk and Waterfront Toronto is going to happen anyhow, we think. This is another disruption, not unlike Uber and Airbnb and others, and we need to be proactive, not reactive, and this opportunity presents us with that chance. We have to find a balance between ring fencing, creating perhaps a sandbox to let industry and other stakeholders experiment while de-risking and making data open. And then finally, the governance model must fit the purpose of this objective, and that includes perhaps privacy, obviously, but also potential monetization.
Great, which is exactly what's up for the next Civic Lab. Anybody else wanted to flag some of the highlights?
Sure, so it's just some of the highlights. So the first thing we talked about is that we need more technologists here and at the table. We also were concerned that we're not convinced that a completely open urban data is realistic, that it may not be sufficiently de-risked. We were concerned about, if we're not going to have a completely open data set, making sure that we don't set up too many barriers, and make it too complicated for people to use the data. And so we were talking about kind of 3 different levels of access, starting with synthetic data and de-identified data in a sandbox, and then maybe looking at a more complicated process for a more rich data set that also deals with the tails of the data. But we were concerned about the issue of equity and justice for groups that might be small and would be marginalized if access was only given to the de-identified, the sufficiently de-identified data sets that you could put in a sandbox. And so we're thinking about other options for making sure that that data gets out there to be used. We also thought that one of the things we'd want to communicate back to Waterfront Toronto was around the idea that, yes, some sort of centralized authority is going to be important for ensuring public trust, standards, making sure that data is accessible, but also that organization might be able to take on the role of helping or engaging in the de-identification process so that it is up to a standard for those organizations that wouldn't otherwise have the internal capability of doing so.
Great. Anybody else want to weigh in with the highlights of your discussion before we take a quick break? We're going to continue this after the break. Yeah, Mark.
Well, we debated a lot of things, but a couple of thoughts for Waterfront Toronto. One is that there's probably already sufficient information that's been released to actually tabletop some use cases. Specifically, for example, around curbside management, which deals with data in a public realm, and building energy management, which deals with data in a private or commercial realm. So I think it's time to move from the abstract to the concrete and actually do something in terms of tabletopping possible models. Second part of that is, Quayside probably won't come to life for at least 3 years. So it's just as likely that whatever comes out of Quayside will get folded into perhaps a broader City of Toronto model than it will actually create its own model. So I think you need to be ready for that to happen, and I'm delighted the City of Toronto actually is pushing forward with that kind of initiative, which may in fact be even potentially a source of, given that there is open data capabilities within the city, it may even be a source, a nucleus of an organization to be created. I don't know if there's anything else.
Anybody else want to quick weigh in? In part, it gets everybody's juices flowing for continuing this discussion. Anybody at this table up here?
No pressure. I won't summarize what we talked about because I know you want me to talk a little bit about the library, but just the advice to Waterfront that from the very beginning, so now, we start talking about what a public education campaign around this looks like across the city, not just in the downtown core with the usual suspects, but what does this mean to be happening in our city at this time for everybody in the city, and we're happy to help with that.
Good. Any of you guys want to weigh in? Not yet. Okay, great.
We had a really rich discussion. I'm looking at Joseph here, who really instigated it around not just talking about privacy, but talking about value and how the public perception on value in terms of the use of data, creation of data. And I think that was a really a great topic about containing, what we're trying to do and having context in the use of that data, and just not talking about privacy, just not talking about stewardship, but talking about value.
That was a big part of the discussion up here as well, and I won't put words in their mouth, but some very healthy reflection on who makes choices for who about what, broader than just a privacy lens. So that was certainly one of the themes that came out here. I'm going to suggest, go ahead, one or two more, and then we'll take a quick break. It's a lot of dense material. We do have a couple more presentations after the break, and then we have a good hour to continue.
So just following up on the discussion of value, we had a good discussion on public good and how some of the data can be used for public good. But it's one of my questions is, so if we want a lot of data for public good, is usually used for behavior modification. So if you want people to use less electricity, less water, use more transit and walk more, that requires heavily personally identifiable data and heavily targeted messaging and nudging. So that's a balance we got to think about.
Agreed. Anyone else want to weigh in before we, yeah, Kevin.
So we talked about, who gets the right to use what data and for what purpose, but where it came around to is who will be enforcing that? How do we ensure compliance so that we can ensure that an individual's privacy is breached? How do you make amends for that, or how do you prevent that from occurring in the first place? And do you have an unequivocal right, or does somebody have the unequivocal right to just reject a person's or a group's or organization's request to get access to data? And I think that hasn't been thought out yet, but it's obviously enforcement is an important part of the equation.
Well, and with the City of Toronto folks in the room and the pending consultation the city will be doing, I'm assuming this is doing some groundwork for some of the topics to cover. Anybody else want to weigh in? Yeah, coming. Joe. Just going to squeeze behind you. Here you go.
Just because there's a couple of topics we got into which weren't covered, just so covered some of those, and quite a lot around consent and why. How do I opt in? How do I not opt in? And what's meaningful in a smart city? And just picking the example of the King Street pilot, you can't give meaningful consent as you walk past a logger or a Bluetooth logger or any other piece or a camera. And so that's kind of a lot of the core of this. The fact that you can't give meaningful consent coupled with uses which are not yet defined a priori. That's some of the nub of why you're getting into this trust and why it's hard to define up front. And then a lot of the nuances around de-identification. But there's much more qualified experts on that space. But the issue here is more around what is a reasonable level of risk? How do you articulate that? Because there is a vast range of types of data we're talking about here, and therefore a vast range of techniques you would identify on. And so more around how do you get to the principle of what's acceptable, rather than getting specific on any one method.
Yeah, great, thank you. Okay, let's take 15 minutes to have a quick break. We're going to start right back at 3:15 sharp, and at that time on the agenda, Chantal Bernier has a talk on models of digital trusts, and Alex and Joe from Mars, Alex Ryan and Joe Greenwood, will talk about their report on civic digital trusts. Then the remaining over an hour 20 minutes left in the meeting, we'll really try and take what's just happened here and go even deeper and have a more comprehensive sort of full room discussion. So leave it to you for 15 minutes. Quarter after, we'll get started. Okay, just in about 3-4 more minutes, we're going to get started. So if you didn't do a nature break or you didn't grab a coffee, now's a good time to do it. 2 or 3, 4 minutes, we're going to start. Okay, if everybody could have a seat. Okay, great. So we're at the point in the agenda where we're going to take a little bit more of a specific focus on digital trusts. And our first presenter will cover models of digital trusts, Chantal Bernier, who's the National Practice Leader, Privacy and Cybersecurity at Dentons. And Chantal recorded her presentation. She's been doing a lot of thinking about this, so we have some slides and her voice, though we do not have her in person. So Carl and John at the back are going to help me out. She's got about 10 minutes. And then once Chantal's piece is complete, Alex Ryan and Joe Greenwood will present from Mars. Over to you.
Greetings. I really wish I could be with you because I always learn so much from the Civic Lab discussions. The purpose of my presentation today is really just to describe various forms of digital data trust models. And if we go to my first slide, these are the main points I'd like to make. The first one being precisely that. There are many data trust models. There isn't one concept that actually constitutes a data trust. A data trust can be established according to any modality or structure that corresponds to the specific purposes or challenges, as well as the vision behind a specific use of personal data. The second point I'd like to make is that while all data trust models are different, what they have in common is the dual objective of increasing privacy safeguards to, in turn, increase the use of personal data. And finally, no data trust can be set up with rules that would not correspond to the applicable privacy legislation. A data trust cannot change rules on consent, on consistency of use, or on safeguarding. In fact, the data trust is precisely there to ensure that privacy law is respected. If we move to the next slide, this is a summary from the Social Economy Data Lab on why the lab feels we need data trusts. Just to put you in context, the UK Social Economy Data Lab is an organization that brings together charities, social enterprises, social funders to collectively make, the lab says, better use of data. So the purpose is one of optimization of data through, obviously, greater sharing. The 4 reasons that the lab puts forward as to why we need data trust, the first one is obviously to protect individuals in relation to privacy and organizations in relation to intellectual property that provide large data sets for this precise optimization of data. The second one is to encourage sharing by creating a framework where there is protection for the data. Then the lab hopes will increase data sharing and therefore have that optimal use of data. Thirdly is to make it possible for organizations to make their private data sets available for public benefit. Obviously, the trust is a screen, so to speak, an intermediary that will protect the data and yet allow it to produce the insights that are needed for greater social or economic analysis. And finally, the reason the lab puts forward as a fourth one is to make data accessible for use when default open model wouldn't be safe or practicable. So clearly the data trust protects the data that must remain protected, but will allow the product of the data, so to speak, to be made available. To my next slide is the main idea behind data trust. Well, obviously, it is borrowed from the concept of property trusts. And that's one of the reasons that data trusts are so criticized. The fact is that personal data is not property that you can simply delegate to someone to manage for you. However, the concept of the property trust is appealing here because it is an existing structure, and it's a structure of mediated accountability, meaning that in the face of great challenge in terms of management of an asset, there is a mediator, there is a trustee who represents the beneficiary to ensure proper management. And that mediated accountability is precisely what is needed in the context of information technology, where there is great power imbalance between individuals and the organizations that use their data, from opacity, from complexity. We really don't know what happens to our data. And so the idea of a data trust is precisely to put someone in the middle that protects the individuals, that protects privacy, and this goes to the last point, to ensure compliance with obligations to respect the fundamental right to privacy, in addition to the existing oversight structures. So if we go to my next slide, two questions I'd like to structure my presentation around. First of all, what can data trusts be? And secondly, what can they not be? So on my next slide, I have here 5 categories, a taxonomy that comes from the Open Data Institute. It's fairly structured, and therefore I thought it would be useful. Moving to my next slide then, let's go to the first structure that the Open Data Institute puts forward, and that's data trust as a repeatable framework of terms and mechanisms. It really is more germane to artificial intelligence, and what it does is creates a protocol or terms for stewardship to allow enhanced sharing and use in the context of greater protection to obtain optimal analytic results. A specific example I would put forward is the British Alan Turing Institute project, where the Institute wanted to increase its machine learning so that it would produce better results and therefore inform public policy more relevantly. To do so, it needed more personal data from public institutions, sometimes sensitive data, such as personal health information. And so the trust was created precisely to protect the data to the level necessary to then allow the transfer of the data and therefore the optimal use through the machine learning. The next slide goes to the second category, and that's data trust as a mutual organizations. And here we're more into the private realm, meaning that all the data subjects are essentially owning the corporation that gathers the data. They remain in control, and there is a form of trusteeship of their data in that structure. The Open Data Institute gives examples of cooperative societies, mutual insurance companies, and building societies. It seems to me we're very much, as I said, in the private realm. And the only analogy I could really make in relation to smart cities is the concept of data as commons in Barcelona. My next slide is the third structure, and that's data trust as a legal structure. And that is more germane to smart cities. This is where the structure is meant to reflect the fact that data subjects are the trustors and the beneficiaries of the data trust. It's democratization of data, if you want to use, again, the Barcelona terminology. A third-party trustee has a duty to make decisions in the best interests regarding access and use. One example could be Decode, decentralization citizens-owned data ecosystems, piloted by Amsterdam and Barcelona, where in that case, the data generated by citizens, the Internet of Things, and the sensors that are set in place to support the smart city, of course, got a data that is protected technologically by encryption and blockchain, but that is also protected from a policy point of view through citizens having direct control and access to their data, but also having modulated consent, whereby a citizen can give consent to personal data for certain benefits or not for others, and therefore control the use of the personal data. And this structure is supervised, so to speak, by the city data protection delegate, who is responsible to guarantee security and privacy of the personal data. That, of course, in addition to the current privacy authorities in Catalonia in Spain, and to, of course, implement the European Data Protection Regulation. The fourth category that we have here is data trust as a store of data. Others call it data vaults. That's where we see the data trust more as a repository where the organizations that have access to the data only have access if the individual has authorized this access, or in the context of public institutions where by law the public institution would have access because of a legitimacy of necessity. There is a data steward who is independent from the organizations that have access to ensure that that access is appropriate and that there is consistency of use. One example we could attach to this category is e-Estonia. The particularity, of course, of Estonia is that the entire government of the country is digitized, so to speak. Personal information is gathered about citizens in every ambit of life, whether personal health information, public safety, or energy, whatever a government actually needs to govern. And so the personal information is compartmentalized, and its access is governed by very clear uses of necessity. And so the public institutions will have access as they are justified to do so. In addition, citizens have direct access to their data through an ID card. The fifth category is that of data trust as public oversight of data access. Here, a lot looser in the sense that it's not a centralized structure. We're more talking about certification processes. And one example is the Singapore Personal Data Protection Commission Trustmark certification, already in place. And it is, like any other certification scheme, based on a selection of organizations that are recognized as independent assessment bodies to perform assessment of organizations, and that assessment will be the basis of the certification as being privacy compliant. And that certification comes from the Singapore Information Media Development Authority. It's valid for 3 years, but as you can see, it's not like essential data trust as the other models have. By the way, the European Data Protection Regulation does have provisions that also mention the possibility of creating certification schemes. My next slide is a quote from Francesca Bria, who is so articulate. I chose to reproduce here this quote from an interview she gave at AI for Good Global Summit in 2018 because I thought it was so eloquent. She describes her vision for a data trust as a privacy-enhancing, rights-preserving, decentralized data infrastructure to give back control of data to citizens. So that's what a data trust can be. Let's move to what it cannot be. A data trust cannot derogate to applicable privacy law. Their role is precisely the opposite. It is to, in fact, increase existing protections from privacy law. The second point is that data trusts cannot act outside the current enforcement framework of privacy protection. So, for example, speaking of a data trust that would decide how certain uses can occur, would always have to decide within what is permissible under privacy law. And that power, if we want to call it so, of the trustee is always under the jurisdiction of the data protection authorities, in our case, in Canada, the privacy commissioners. And finally, data trusts cannot evade the privacy commissioner's jurisdiction. And in fact, I would expect that if indeed a data trust was to be set up in Canada, after just enough time to give to the trust to function effectively, I would expect the privacy commissioner competent to exercise audit powers to monitor the effectiveness of the data trust. So the bottom line, and that's my last slide, is a data trust can take the form a community wants according to the data use it wants to allow to ensure privacy protection in that use. Thank you.
Tell her people were clapping in her absence. But between that and Lisa's comments about all the different angles on how to think about a trust, I think there are plenty of ideas floating around. Okay, last but not least for our presentations today, Alex Ryan and Joe Greenwood from Mars are going to present a little bit about their report on civic digital trusts. If you've already had a chance to look at it before today, it's probably a refresh. But for those who haven't gotten into the details, we'll turn it over to Alex for sure, and Joe joins you. As before, if you don't mind hanging on to any questions until he's done, I'm sure there'll be a chance to ask him questions after. Alex.
Thank you, Nicole. So I'm going to give you this presentation, our Civic Digital Trust Primer, which was sent as a read-ahead, so I don't expect all of you to read it, but if not, there is one thing I would like you to do at least, which is to go onto the aspirations page of the document and take the SurveyMonkey survey. We designed it as an interactive report, which means that there's a chance for everyone to have their say. And we soft launched this at the start of the year. We've so far only had 9 people participate. So I think we can boost that with another 40 or 50 participations from the people in the room here today. So that's just a bit of a plug. So this was the question back in July last year. We went to Waterfront Toronto and we pitched this idea to launch a project to explore the potential of a data trust to enable responsible data sharing in smart cities. And at the time, what we realized was that what was really needed in this area was a broad public engagement around the privacy and the data layer of a smart city or a smart neighborhood. And what we realized was that while there was this solution that people were talking about internationally called a data trust, nobody had really heard of the term locally, and so it was really, the first job was really to get something that could be accessible and that could explain the basic concept to folk. So that was the concept that we went with. And so to get to that, this is the process that we followed. We started out with a rapid research scan, looked at these different models that we've been talking about here today, and we also conducted 12 semi-structured interviews with experts and to find out what their latest thinking was and what they were seeing the promise of this model. We then convened a couple of co-design workshops. A number of people here in the room were a part of our workshop out at Bridgepoint in November, and that workshop was carefully curated to bring together all 3 levels of government, private sector, civil society, and really try and get all of the voices in the room that we were hoping to represent. We had members of the DSAP panel give a bit of a Q&A to level set, and then we went into a range of participatory exercises. And then we took some of the exercises that we developed for that workshop, and we ran the use case version through the open house number 4 of Waterfront Toronto and Civic Labs in December. So we got another 200 people from the general public participating in that open house, got to give us feedback through that form as well. Our idea with this was that we wanted to be as open as possible in the publishing and the editing process. So we decided to publish it as a Git book hosted on GitHub. That means that people could come in, anybody who saw something, if we'd made a mistake or you had a better way of phrasing things, or you could get it more accurate or more accessible to folks, anybody can go in, and there are people in the room here who have given us a number of great suggestions through that functionality to upgrade the content. So it really is a living document that can continue to flesh out. We did hear some great case studies in that previous presentation by Chantal, but we really are at the infancy of this. There's really not that many great independently assessed examples of data trust globally. So we do want this document to continue to evolve. We want anybody to participate. So you can participate by actually co-writing and co-authoring, but you can also participate by just taking these simple quizzes. All of the exercises that we ran in our workshop have been turned into quizzes that you can take so that we can get a broader sample of input from people. Okay, so top 3 insights from the work that we've done on this project. Number 1, we started this out saying, we're going to have a very open mind about this concept. We're not sure if it's the right solution. We still can't confidently say that a civic digital trust is what is needed for Quayside, but we do say that this kind of model definitely has potential and is worth exploring further. And we want to explore that further by getting very tangible around use cases and building out actual prototypes, low resolution and then medium resolution prototypes to test out some of the different parts of the model. So we definitely think that this is not the only model. Joe will speak to you to some of the other models that we've uncovered that have already come up earlier in today's discussion. But we do think this is definitely a model worth exploring and given serious consideration. Secondly, we started this project thinking about questions like who owns the data, who controls the data. We actually found a better set of questions, which is really about who has access for what uses. I think that's really the important point, and Mark wanted me to give a special shout out to that one. So yeah, that's, I think it's all about use. The collection is important, the ownership is important, but actually how the data is used and what uses are not allowed is the key question, and by what classes of actors. And secondly, the reason we're calling this a civic digital trust, we chose that language very intentionally. We started out calling it a data trust, which is a more common terminology. We chose the word digital rather than data to refer to the whole digital layer. Because in the days of artificial intelligence and machine learning, having access to the data sets without seeing the algorithms is of pretty limited use. So I think it's both, and in fact it's the full digital layer. It's understanding what specific sensors are where, and it's not necessarily that the data trust or the digital trust have ownership of all of these assets, but they at least have to have some kind of oversight and transparency to be able to take into account emerging issues like algorithmic transparency. And the word civic is important to us as well, because this should be for public benefit by the public. And so very much aligns with that quote from City of Barcelona that Chantal used in terms of that empowerment of citizens. And therefore, it's really important to think through the civic participation mechanisms. We're engaged at Mars in a number of conversations around data sharing, and often those are very technical conversations held between people who have large stores of data and people who want to use those data for commercial purposes. And I think it's really important that the citizen voice not get lost in this, particularly when it comes to neighbourhoods where people live, work and play and visit, that they need to, their voice and their concerns and their interests and their values need to really drive the whole thing. So that's our top line insights. Okay, so we've talked a bit about like what is the problem this is trying to solve. A digital trust is a subset of kinds of approaches to digital governance or digital stewardship, so they're slightly broader frames. And what we identified in the digital trust through our different consultations was that there were 4 particular needs that people were identifying. One is the need for security. Whenever you start to collect and share data, there is the potential for a data breach and also data misuses. And so there is clearly a need for some kind of governing body for the purpose of security. There is also the need for privacy. And so we heard very strongly that privacy is a driving concern here. And so it's not just promoting individual privacy, but it's also group privacy, which is an emerging area of the literature, and it's also an area where one of those legal gaps where we don't actually have any legal framework around group privacy in Canada. And then thirdly, we heard about equity as being one of the needs here, is that the reason people care about aggregating these data sets and sharing them is because they're valuable. This is a source of analytic insight, and that insight can make services run better. So there is great value to be captured here, but if we're not smart about the way that we do it, then we could actually exacerbate inequality through the work. And so it's very important that equity lens be placed on the way that we do a civic digital trust. And lastly, competitiveness. There's competitiveness for Canada in that if we completely outlaw data sharing, then that's probably not great for our competitiveness. But at the same time, there were concerns expressed in our workshop that, that sharing some data from the public realm in the context of organisations which have massive stores of commercial data means that you could be creating asymmetries, and those asymmetries could be creating anti-competitive practices or monopolies. So that's another consideration that needs to be taken into account as you consider these different models for essentially the problem it's trying to solve is the governance of the digital layer. Okay, so I'm not going to dwell on the definition of a trust because we've been there a few times already today in the presentations by lawyers who are far more qualified to define them than I am. But this is kind of the legal definition that we put in the trust. It's one of the more simple and accessible ones that we found. And we built up this simple visual model of the digital trust to show the different actors. You have the trustor-trustee relationship, the trustor being the people who are collecting the data, the trustee being the ones with the fiduciary responsibility, the beneficiaries being in the centre of this diagram, being those residents and visitors of the smart city. You've got the smart city itself with all of the IoT embedded sensors, and then the asset that we're talking about here, which we've acknowledged is not exactly property, but it is the code, but it's also the data. And then finally, there is a purpose. With a digital trust, there is a purpose, and that could be that charitable purpose or that public interest purpose that's been talked about as well. Okay, so we identified through this work 4 key elements that need to be designed. One is the legal agreement, so the actual legal structure of the trust. The second one being the technical architecture, which allows the collection, storage, access, and use of the data. Then the business model, which allows the entity, whether this is public, private, or somewhere in between, allows it to be long-term sustainably funded, and without that funding source compromising the integrity and the impartiality of the trust. And then you need a mechanism for civic participation so that people can have their voices heard. We asked people what their aspirations were for the trust. This is a reminder to go and vote on the website so that we can see what you aspire to. These were the 4 that got the top ratings from the workshop. One was to bring forward the voices of marginalised groups, so really a concern for the equity lens and justice. Secondly was to promote local and Canadian economic development. Thirdly, people wanted the trust to be a way of strengthening democratic governance and institutions. And lastly, to create strong community of engagement and empowerment. So they're all pretty exciting things to be attempting with the trust. And then these were the principles that came to the top in the voting. And so the first one was algorithmic transparency. Second was enabling open dialogue and education around data sharing and its uses. Thirdly, ensure oversight and controls for data sharing. And lastly, open mechanisms for consent. So now I'll hand over to Joe. He'll get into some of the more detail around the use cases, some of the alternative models, and then next steps.
So the next part of what we did is we wanted people to pretend and get real about, if you were a data trust, what would you do? And so one of the questions was, there's enough examples, can't we actually get tangible? And that it's not the data or the ownership, it's the use. So what we did was make them work through use cases. So the use cases were prototypical descriptions of, here are the types of data, here are the uses that might be considered, and we asked them to think through, what does it mean to be a beneficiary? What does it mean to be a trustee? And so very quick two-line summary of some of these use cases. Smart health assistance was about, at the system level, can we use data from a smart city to understand population health dynamics and population demand and where we should put services? And at the very personalized level, can we be proactive about the individual who's at risk and be that, think the elderly, think the homeless, think those who might be who need assistance quickly? At the mobility level, all this data from a smart city at a systems level helps us think about congestion, about optimization of services, about balancing private movement services like Lyft and Uber alongside public transit. And at the personal level, it's about, well, where am I? How do I commission a service? And where's my data in that? And how do I get a personal mobility service or curbside services or parking? The adaptable spaces cross the fuzzy line that exists in a smart city between the public realm and the private realm. So this is about how do we sense data in private buildings and optimize their use. And so these might be mixed uses of buildings. They're thinking about how do people flow through at a systems level, and then very specifically, how do I reconfigure your space given I know what you did in it, or that there are sensors about, say, a workplace and what's happening in it. And then fourthly was a building and utility consumption. So this is at a systems level. Can we forecast peaks of demand? Can we optimize the load balancing of the grid? Can we deploy new services locally? By the way, can we offer you incentives to change your behavior in your building because we know about what's happening in that situation? And then, so we thought these were good tests, and then our participants pointed out there's an elephant in the room, that actually there's already a huge imbalance of data, and that's all the consumer profiling data. And there are very large commercial entities who know an awful lot about individuals. And what happens if a large advertising organization, a personal tracking organization, a multinational media or other organization who has very detailed profiling also had access to data about the public realm and then knew about you, and it could relate those two? We need to address the fact that there's trust, not necessarily enough trust in that realm to start with, yet alone at breaching the public realm. So that was all around how do we enable a more enabled citizen in that circumstance. So we got very specific. We worked through some exercises and made them think through what happened. High level, if you want to build a data trust and think through, it depends on the specifics. So use and use cases is the real nub and the crux of this. And that through nearly all of them, many of them were contentious and highly conditional. The decisions that would be made highly conditional on the specifics of the data, the level of aggregation, the level of consent, if it was personal or for systems level use. And that came out through all of these things. And so that goes to the nub of what the framework and the decision-making rationale of such an entity and the legal structure would have to deal with. Interestingly, in the health space, despite the fact there's existing legislation and you have some of the most, I would say, sophisticated frameworks to deal with health information because of the nature of it and the consent framework, that even there's potentially still value in a trust because we're seeing more privately sourced data and uses of data, health data, alongside non-health data for commercial use or optimization and provision of services. So even there was interest in that a trust may address some of those extensions of what's happening. In the building, utility, and consumption space, there's a sense that, again, there's lots that's been done in this space, but a non-profit board could be seen to be balancing economic incentives against consumer interest. And there are broader public individual benefits from this data that currently is very hard for them to access unless they do their own sensing. And then in the combined consumer and public realm, as I kind of gave a sense in the two-line summary, there's two worlds of data here. There's the large amounts of data already held by the private sector, think mobile phone companies, think multimedia companies, think digital service providers, and what's coming from the smart city. And the challenge that broke down here is around participation. Why would you, if you hold that rich set of privately sourced data, want to put it in trust just to access what's available from the public realm? And the incentives to participate for all sides of the trust, think particularly private entities, have to be thought through. There's a value exchange before there's a data exchange, and in that realm, there's a lot to think about. So those examples here. Then in the adaptable spaces example, there's a lot around broadly the types of data and how could we monitor and enforce rules and use of a building. How does that come over use with tracked use of space and utilization patterns? And again, some highly contentious issues here about what is the interest of a building operator and owner versus tenant versus and those relationships, and what do they know and what are they able to do as a result of that? And also about the sense of where does the public and private realm stop and start. In the mobility setting, again, as I said, the uses were very specific, but there's a real kind of view that there is a significant public good here. They do speak to public safety and improvement, but there's also a significant potential for tracking and surveillance and how you balance those two. And again, this is where a trust was felt to be appropriate about being able to give traceability of those decisions and actual uses. So one of the things, given that a trust is it's a new concept, as you start to understand it, it's obvious, there's actually a lot of, it's a fairly sophisticated construct for data governance. There's a lot of complexity to it. We looked at the alternatives. And maybe what I'll do is, there's a couple of others that I'd leave around here, but I think Kevin's diagram, which went left to right as you looking at it, was around openness at one end towards closed at the other. So you have increasing sophistication and complexity, those that are dealing with very open and relatively simple sets of data exchanges, all towards more complex ones. So fundamentally, open data is an option, but it's where you don't have to control trust. You don't have a restriction on use, you've dealt with identity, you've dealt with those things, you can make it freely available. So that's probably our furthest left as you're looking at this. Then we'd start to look at data licensing, and the vast majority of how data is shared right now is in one-on-one private legal agreements between two entities. And this deals with the vast majority of how most data is given. Its data licenses are often bound into most application programming interfaces and other digital service layer agreements, essentially granting licenses. And why? Because it's simple, it's one-to-one, you're enforcing between two private parties, and you can wrap it up in a wider set of business or contracts. But the challenge is that breaks down in a multilateral way, or a multilateral agreement, and the nuance of data IP versus software and other rights, which have been alluded to already, also need to be thought about. So then we start to get into some other more complex agreements where we're essentially dealing with multilateral agreements. And so how do you deal with bilateral and multilateral sharing agreements? And typically you end up with sharing agreements, as in it's two-way or there's multi-partner, or we're partnering because we think there's a broader business value that we're partnering on, and data is part of that. So it often starts to include some level of central infrastructure, some level of central organization to coordinate or manage those commitments from those multiple entities. But it's all framed in the interest of those entities, those that are sharing the data, not of a third party outside of that. So the beneficiary, the citizen, the public good is not yet represented in that model. And so they have to have complementary information. But what breaks down in that is where, one, the overhead and complexity, or two, there's a public good at stake. And so that's where this idea of a data collaborative has started to bind some interest, and I share the link there. And if you go to that, there's a good list of examples. And I thought the specifics and the examples really help here, so I'd encourage you to look at that. And it is, as it says here, beyond the public-private partnership model. Different sectors realize they have something of value to a public good, and they're prepared to put it into a collaborative model where the decision of use is in the interest of the broader collaborative interest. Again, they're not legally bound as strongly as a trust, but they are making a commitment around uses in a collaborative public interest realm, not just their own or the participants. There are some limitations that you have to get into. What is the public good? Who can use it? And how do you manage those nuances? But that's kind of trying to give you a bit of a range from the open through to the more collaborative model. And I would say data trust is then further to the right as you're looking at it in terms of the level of complexity, the level of rigor and control. And beyond that, you get into things like designated entities, which are legally designated to have control of the data set in the health sector. So there's actually a broad range. I'm trying to put this into some context. Why are you having to go towards that further right-hand end of the spectrum to illustrate the sense of where a trust sits and to compare it to contrast it. So lastly, some next steps. Really, the proof is going to be, does this work by example? So our next steps, and this is an open invitation to participate, not just through the web, but also where we go next, is essentially prototyping. So this is paper-based prototyping, getting hyper-specific on, no, we mean these variables in this data set, put in this application, work through this legal agreement, what would happen? And so that you can actually pull out these nuances. And then a high-resolution prototype, maybe map that onto a specific technology, a particular ownership model or financial model. So that's where we think we would go next with this, to try and bring this to life. And when we do that in a safe, kind of stepwise way, you'll see whether a trust does work, and hopefully we can build trust in the process of establishing a trust by doing it this way.
Great. Thanks a lot. So I think this was quite deliberate on Waterfront Toronto's part to sort of have Lisa's frame on things, have Kevin's frame on things, Chantel's frame on things, Mars' frame on things. You got a bunch of different frames on things here, including the discussion that happened before the break where people started saying, well, actually, we look at it primarily this way, or we talked about it that way. Clearly, there's a lot of work to be done here to find some common ground among various narratives and provide some good advice for this stage of what will inevitably be a very, very long discussion in this town, I think. So before we go back to discussion, I just wanted to see if there were any questions. I can't ask Chantel questions. Chantel's for, questions for the Mars team before we move back into hearing. I'm going to go back to a small table discussion for you to pick up where you left off before the break and see if there is anything else you wanted to share with Waterfront Toronto at this time. Anybody have any questions for the Mars team? All right, here we go. Go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm not sure exactly who this question is for, but who pays for what? I think this is what I'm trying to wrap my head around. I understand all the discussions on privacy. I can see those happening, but who pays for what? It's a civic digital trust. So if the beneficiary pays, is this the assumption that the public will pay? And then again, the question is for what? So I think that's my big question.
Do you want to weigh in, Christina? I know we had talked about having an overlay on the digital ecosystem that shows paths for money. Exactly. On the paper that you've got on your table, we've talked often about needing the overlay that says, how does money flow? Where do the resources go, from where, to who, as a result of all of these relationships, which comes back to one of the questions right at the beginning of the meeting. So maybe hand it over to Christina.
So I don't think we have a solid answer for that right now. And I think part of that is we haven't seen what, in the context of the conversation with Sidewalk, they're proposing in terms of their business model and if there's some resources available for sort of setting up and starting this. The model that I talked to earlier about the Windsor-Essex model, for instance, the stakeholders who actually had an interest in maintaining that digital infrastructure on behalf of the community each paid the proportion of the total amount that they could afford to bear. And it was based on their total overall, not revenues, but basically their total overall budgets in the context of each other. And they paid their appropriate proportion of the overall bill. And it wasn't a huge amount for anyone, but it would have been a big amount for anybody to try and do on their own. So I think we're looking at those types of models as well as anything else that people may actually have had context around internationally where this has happened. There is some conversation around whether or not this is one of those things that would be funded through tax revenue, which is not something that I think we're currently considering. There's also a way of looking at how you could take existing assets and just increase the revenue or increase the funding towards existing assets for groups of, for instance, the library. You know, is there a way of actually just giving them an appropriate amount of budget to augment what they currently have to be able to take on these new responsibilities? So there's so many different ways of sort of looking at this. I think it's more important to look at what the priority objectives are for what this body would do, and then look at what kind of funding would be needed to actually stand that up and also to sustain it over time. And then based on who has greatest jurisdiction and also the greatest benefit from that, looking at where potential revenue sources may come from. So it's a long way of saying big question mark, but a lot of really good ideas that have been out there and need to be looked at even further. But it is the big burning platform question.
Good luck, she says. All right. Any other questions? I mean, this is exactly why all these brains are in the room.
So I'm just curious what the role or opportunity is for the private sector in a civic data trust or digital trust.
Do you want to, anybody who's speaking to trust, Lisa, I know you're not on the hot seat anymore, but anybody from Mars, you guys want to talk about role for the private sector in a data trust?
Sure. I would say essential. Most of this data is going to be collected in some form by a private sector actor underneath, be it because they own it or under contract to a public entity. Most of the technology and expertise to implement some of the technology lies there, some of the legal expertise lies there. So I think, essentially, I think also some of the value that's created from data will happen in the private sector. And realistically, if you're not going to use tax revenue, you need to find some way of appropriating some of that commercial value to pay for the cost of a trust. So those are some of the ways I think they're going to play out.
If I can just build on that, sorry, I still have a microphone, which is a dangerous thing. So just going back to the model from Windsor-Essex, though, what was interesting is that the private sector had a seat on the board, but it was a non-voting seat. So they were able to share their knowledge and wisdom. They were able to bring forward ideas, but they weren't actually able to make decisions based on the public interest. So you didn't lose the value of their inputs, but they weren't actually steering the conversation, which worked well in a lot of contexts. But I was explaining to somebody earlier, in individual projects, at times we wanted to have them more engaged in the fact that we didn't have a mechanism to do so. There was a bit of a deficit there in actually advancing projects more quickly and also with regards to those resources. So it's something to definitely weigh.
All right. Coming.
So maybe you're still so high level that I'm not sure this question applies, but there was a recent release of article based on freedom of information requests about predictive policing now in Canada. And so that question was raised, I think, in relation to the mobility scenario, but then seemed to have been dropped. If that is on the table as a potential risk scenario, how would these various models for data trusts act or potentially act to mitigate risks related to predictive policing?
Okay, so for the Mars folks, unless there's anybody else that wants to jump in, did any of the research uncover sort of any of the risk mitigation that would happen, like the scenario the questioner asked?
I'm not sure we could comment specifically. I think that's given that that's a very nuanced use and has multiple levels of legal jurisdictional impact on it. But the point that was raised is that, and at this level of the workshop at least, was the fact that you could imagine it could get put to that use was what was triggering the discussion. And so therefore, how do you make assurance that it was or wasn't appropriately done? So I think that's the level we got to, rather than saying exactly how would a trust deal with it.
So it needs to do it, but it didn't say how. Good.
Correct.
Okay, needs to do it, agreement, doesn't say how. Good. Next, John.
Thanks a lot. I'm curious if the Mars work that you were doing turned up anything around the question of, I guess what I want to ask about is sector development, economic sector development, granular, grassroots level look at the supply side of sector development. So what I mean to say is that there's a lot of emphasis on hard services and curbside services and so on, that type of data. And secondly, on retail, what we buy and so on, how we behave as consumers. But has anybody looked at whether the trust could be set up to mobilize data, which is now not easy to mobilize, around capital flows, supply chains, labor market demand in particular? Because from a local government perspective, it's a big gap in how we can support economic development. It's just much too difficult to get that data. So realizing it would be a new demand on business, but has anybody globally used the setting up of a trust to try to look at sector development in that way?
And I'm eyeballing Joe and Alex, but I suspect there might be others in the room who might want to weigh in too. We'll start here. One or both of you.
I'd say no, we haven't seen that, but there are some really interesting initiatives happening in Canada around that. And Joe could speak to some of the employment pathways platform type initiatives around doing that kind of matching. And also the Future Skills Centre, which was announced, is another initiative to do that. So, but I don't see the data trust coming into those discussions right now. Joe, did you want to add to it?
Yeah, it didn't come up in this discussion, but the analogy of the private sector already shares a lot of pay information and recruitment information because it helps them get competitive intelligence. What if you created a trust where you could share more about supply chains and our dynamics because it helped them and gave us economic visibility? Was an idea I was toying with, which so it's interesting, but I haven't seen it been applied yet. The only real strong private sector use case is probably the IBM MasterCard example in Europe, which is all around consumer profiling within the context of GDPR.
Great. Okay. Yeah, next one.
A couple of questions. One, given that you have a range of data when you're talking about predictive policing or health, very private, building utility use, not private, are you better off having one trust that deals with everything, or might you have a model where you have different, a whole series of trusts, and that might be a better way to deal with it? And I mean, framing, I just want to emphasize that whole who pays for it seems to be a very key question, because that's really going to tell you who's going to benefit from it, who's willing to step up and pay, I think. So maybe it's wrapped up in that. And the second question is, if you're using an equity lens, there will be a lot of people who would benefit from use of the data, but who wouldn't be in a position to contribute costs, or they would benefit from using data that someone else has prepared in those algorithms. How do you build that in that equity access for organizations that wouldn't be part of the trust?
Okay, so I'm going to look at both of you, and then again, if there's anyone in the room who wants to add on. So the first question, are you better off with one trust or potentially a series of trusts that have different jobs? And then the second one about how you get people to access who may not be able to afford to pay.
Yeah, so there's a series of trade-offs between one or many trusts, and I think on one hand, once you've figured out how to set up one, it probably doesn't have a lot of overhead to set up multiple of these potentially. So you could think of an ecosystem of data trusts, each with very prescribed purposes. On the other hand, the benefit of a trust is a lot of the benefits come from the aggregation and the connection of dissimilar data sources. Of course, that's where the risk comes as well. So I think the short answer is no, but it's a complex trade-off, and again, nobody's decided what would be the best model there. With the equity lens, I think you would normally look towards a third-party payer, whether that's philanthropy or government, to be able to support the interests of those who are unable to pay for the data themselves. So that would be how I would think about the business model side of that.
Okay, anybody else want a question at this stage? Okay, we've got just about 45 minutes left. What I'm going to suggest is we split it, sort of 20-20, and continue the discussions at your table. We did not hear from everybody prior to the break because it was sort of just a taster, I guess. Continue the discussion based on what you've heard now. See if there is anything else you want to share in terms of your wisdom or observations with Waterfront Toronto at this stage. And we'll come back together in 20 minutes, hear from the group, and then wrap up. So turn it over to you. Same question as before the break, advice for Waterfront Toronto around what they need to consider when it comes to data stewardship and digital stewardship at Quayside. Hi, everybody. 5 more minutes, and we're going to have a full room discussion. So 5 more minutes. Maybe that was my fault. Yeah. Hi, everybody. Just for the last 15 minutes or so, we're going to move around the room a little bit just to see our table conversation evolved quite a bit from the pre-break discussion. I'm assuming that probably happened in other places also. Anybody want to start us off? Give us a flavor of how your conversation unfolded. Of course, we've got people taking notes at all the tables, but we'd like to hear from participants if there's anything you want to flag or reinforce as a result of your discussions. Coming.
I'm definitely not speaking for my whole table. I just, there's, and nor covering everything, but you said one particular thing, so I wanted to add the one particular thing. We had a conversation about public education component and who's providing that public education component and what the bias might be and whoever's providing the education itself. So one suggestion that I had is that potentially there could be a fund that is from the government or Waterfront Toronto within the public sector, a fund that is open that people could apply to be able to provide that education that would encourage a wider application, a wider diversity of people applying for it and being able to use that funding for educational purposes, so that education isn't, runs the risk of, certainly wouldn't want it to become propaganda. And so I think by having more voices at the table, you reduce that risk.
All right. Any other thoughts to share or flag? Definitely do not have to have this part of the meeting where it's an open course, but I think often you're talking about things at your table that are interesting to others in the room, so absolutely encourage you to share those.
We went down the funding rabbit hole, and so the advice I think though that came back that we would give is that we want to make sure that the funding model for a digital trust would have the right economic incentives to make sure that data was being used and there was data sharing. So we also talked, though, about the dangers of relying entirely on a private sector funding model, because if for some reason that funding went away, there would still be important what do we call them? Public interest, legacy public interest benefits to the trust to manage the assets into the future.
Great. Thanks. Anybody here want to jump in? Give us a flavor. Nicole. All right. Michael.
Yeah, so I think our table has I think had a fair amount of uncertainty still around, frankly, this whole concept. With the notion that on the one hand, there's a bit of a feeling that there is concern about data collection and some of the large players and the implications of projects like this, and the feeling that the laws may not adequately address some of those issues, so here's a shiny new object that might. And so we talked about the need for better precision on the one hand about what exactly it is that we're talking about, whether it's a co-op or a trust and what that might entail. And on the other hand, striking to see the range of things people are looking for out of this trust. I mean, everything from equity-seeking groups on the one hand to innovation to finding ways to fund this, which also, I think, leaves the distinct notion that this is this undefined sort of measure that is whatever it is you want it to be because you've got some kind of concerns that remain unaddressed right now. And so wouldn't this be a great way to fix it, even though we don't really know what this is?
Full circle eyeballing Lisa right here. I mean, that's where she started us off. Well, not exactly like that, but along those lines. Okay, let's go over to the left there. Yeah.
So I don't want to claim that I'm speaking for the table, more for myself in terms of how I dominated the conversation. But
good honesty.
But to build on what was just said, one of the things that I think we kind of hit on was that it seems an awful lot like this is a solution in search of a particular problem, and that there's a need to go, and Joe has, I know, done some of this with the use cases, what we did at the last meeting on this, but there's trying to get people to better understand the public good and the benefits and the whole idea. The idea behind this goes back to the smart city thing and what a smart city can do and what it can bring you. And then I think if people had a much better understanding of that, then you can have a more meaningful conversation around what are the trade-offs for this. Because we, for instance, just like the health tracking and monitoring and do you want that and stuff. And it was like, well, no, I don't want it. But somebody mentioned, his 20-year-old daughter wouldn't care because, they'd let everybody access everything. But on the other hand, I would want it from my elderly parents. So there are, I think, for getting a better understanding of what the underlying public goods are and the benefits help you then drive and understand how you build this thing and what it's supposed to be and how it's supposed to work and what the aim of that it's really supposed to achieve in terms of making some of these smart city benefits actually possible.
Anybody want to jump on that as a theme? Anybody else cover that kind of lens on the conversation? I'm just going to start with this table and let the mic hang in the air above the table a little bit. And just so the rest of you can prepare, I'll do that going towards the back here. If everybody passes, no problem. But anybody around here? There we go.
We had a lengthy discussion as well on the public education part and how, how few people are engaged in any serious way in the topic. And if people are going to trust the trust, you're going to have to bring a broad public along. And there's something in the public process to date, whether it's the roundtables or whether it's the documents that are produced that just isn't engaging people. I mean, you had 9 people take your survey so far, right? So there's something deeply missing in the way we're engaging people. So we need a quantum leap in how that's done.
All right, anybody over here want to jump in? Great.
Well, our conversation kind of got back to focusing on specific use cases from the Mars presentation. And we talked about sort of the importance of being able to have that level of direct control over how your data is being used and transacted, both in public space and in your personal or private space. So we thought that was very important. And then on the whole who pays question for a governance model, we felt that this is something that would need to be looked at very closely, especially if you have a private funder or a philanthropic funder, and that rules for governance would still need to be very robustly respected, even if you have a private funder. And the whole who pays question.
Great, thanks. Anybody here want to give us a flavor of how your conversation unfolded? Lots of hands jumping for the mic. No dice. Alex, you took lots of good notes? All right, anybody here? Go ahead.
So one thing that we talked about building on Sibel's points, she raised some really compelling points around predictive policing risks around some of these technologies more broadly. So I think even putting that, even without going that far, I think that whatever organization is involved in the control and management of data needs to have some sort of law enforcement request policy, and that's something that should be consulted on and thought through as part of this process. So again, you don't have to go all the way down the rabbit hole of future-oriented, kind of technologies, but even basic questions about what information is made available in what circumstances, for what purposes, and under what authorities.
Okay. Anybody? Yeah, great. Come in.
We talked quite a bit about my concern that we're applying old paradigms or frameworks to new territory when there's an opportunity, in fact, to disrupt the paradigms that resulted in the problems in the first place. So whether it's data reductionism, old value assessments or old strategies for value assessments, scarcity models, old notions of ownership and security, etc. We seem to be transporting all of those old paradigms that caused many of our problems to this new space. And so we were talking about the possibility of rethinking what are the goals, where do we want to go, and what can we abandon that has caused us those problems.
What did you come up with? We're all, what's the new paradigm?
Well, we talked about...
What's the new paradigm you were shifting towards? I mean, that's why we're in the room. So what is it that, where can you push the boundary?
Well, some of the things we talked about was abandoning some of the scarcity models and thinking more about all of those, well, I guess they're categorized under abundance strategies, where we rethink where can the value come from, legislative constraints that prevent us from mobilizing communities. We talked about co-ops as well. I shouldn't be the only one talking. There were quite a few.
You're going to get the mic in a second.
Sure.
Yeah.
I think one example we talked about was, we talked about Uber, for example, and one of the problems with Uber is that it's this kind of monopolistic, extractive platform where the value goes up and out of the environment, and that a better model is one that kind of keeps the value in with at the city level with the drivers themselves, and more of a cooperative model, as an example.
That's great. Go ahead. Well, it'll be
so-
easy to get a ride in Quayside as we got over here.
Ooh, so I feel very young today because I have a lot of questions starting with why. So
Somebody needs to answer, even though they might not answer right now.
maybe it's because maybe I'm just coming in at this stage. But sometimes you want to ask questions, the governance of the governance kind of a thing. So I think there were a couple of mentions before about we're marching towards a solution and maybe we forgot what the objective is all about. So, one why question could be, why Google? Have we looked at everything that is available out there? If we are leading with the pure objective of enabling a smart city, maybe there's different ways to get us to that objective. So it would be interesting to maybe, sometimes you're just going ahead in a certain way, and sometimes you just need to take a big step back and relook at what are we trying to do here, actually. So a lot of why questions.
A nice reminder. Anybody at this table want to weigh in? Yes, no? Yeah, go ahead.
Just in terms of emphasizing that the government does need to lead this, and maybe that hasn't happened so far. So, if we can say one thing to Waterfront Toronto, it's you need to lead the discussion, you need to lead the process, you need to define the public good, not Google, not anybody else. And we did talk in terms of government control about things like resource extraction, and is there some model you can use to kind of control data and control its use and control the public good that it is being used for? And one big danger, if you are going to use a digital civic trust or something like that, is how do you control mission creep?
Not necessarily to tack on more time today, but I would welcome some views and thinking on this idea of the government, because we have 3 orders of government here that, and I know that was in your mind, right? But just to clearly articulate that we do have 3 orders of government that have an interest in this particular project. Elsewhere across the country, there are other projects going on. Is this fundamentally a municipal issue if we're dealing with, municipal services largely, or municipal transit, that kind of thing? Or are we taking it up a notch to the provincial level? I don't know that the federal government should own this issue. Clearly there's an interest and a role to play, but if we're talking about a civic data trust or collaborative or some sort of model for a specific smart cities project, welcome views on what level of government should really take the lead in stewarding government's involvement or ownership or leadership there.
Well, I think we have all three levels in the room listening and thinking, hopefully. Yep.
Well, I'm not responding as any part of government or anything, but I do wonder, why are we talking about the trust as only relevant to this specific project? If it's a civic data trust, then one of the ways to mobilize civic engagement is to remind people that there's data in North Scarborough, there's data in Etobicoke, and if this model in Quayside appears to have value to stakeholders, and in that sense it works, it will become a template for development in other parts of the city. That's a public education campaign in a nutshell, to show people your data is next. Yeah. So why would the trust be limited?
Good call, good call. Okay, any other thoughts or comments? Otherwise, Christina, I know we had thought I can walk over with the mic there. You were going to give some wrap-up remarks or come on up to the front. Our team is, as you know, we've been taking a lot of notes through the discussion, so by no means will our report be limited to what we've heard through the plenary conversations, and we'll endeavor to get that to you quickly, as we did for the first Civic Lab. I'll hand it over to Christina for some wrap-up remarks.
So thank you to everyone for sharing your perspectives and ideas today. And I think, some of the themes that emerged today came out a bit more loudly and clearly than perhaps they did at the first session, and are maybe even topics for additional civic labs where we can dig deeper on those very finite items. And I think the precision point is something that is very important in the next phase of the discussions that we have on this issue, as well as making sure that there's more voices around the table. To the last point around this being, I wouldn't necessarily say a template, but a model that may work in other areas is something that's worth exploring more fulsomely with other voices that aren't here yet today. One of the things I wanted to mention is, just like at the last Civic Lab, we still have our Civic Labs at waterfronttoronto.ca email address, which you would have received all of your confirmations from. If you have additional insights or thoughts that you would like to share with us as part of the report out from this session, if you can share those with us by Friday end of day, that would be great, so we can incorporate those into the report. And then we also, I think there's a slide with the details for the next Civic Lab. If you can save the date for Tuesday, March 26th from 2 to 5:30 p.m., we are going to be starting to peel back the onion that is intellectual property, data ownership, and smart city architecture, which we will not be able to get through all three of those things with the depth required and do them justice. So that may even get fragmented down to one or two of those for that particular item, and then defer that back to the larger digital consultation for some of the pieces we can't get to. But this has been a conversation that is long overdue that we're looking forward to having as well. So thank you again, and thank you for joining us even after our snowstorm date that got moved. And we look forward to hearing from you and appreciate your voices again today. Thank you.